Ladies and gentlemen, please take seats. We're about to start the session. Please take your seats.
Jeden.
Excellencies, ministers, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. It's a great honor and a true privilege to welcome you all to the opening of the 23rd Human Dimension Implementation Meeting here in Warsaw. Let me start by greeting our distinguished speakers and thanking them for accepting our invitation and joining us here this morning. As always, we will start with opening remarks by our esteemed guests. First, we will hear introductory remarks from our chairperson in office, Mr. Miroslav Lajčák, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Slovakia. Next, we will hear an address by the Foreign Minister of Poland, Mr. Jacek Czaputowicz, representing the government of our generous host country. The Polish government has been an invaluable partner and ally for more than a quarter of a century, and it is thanks to the Minister's support that we were able to get this venue for our 2019 meeting. We will then be joined by our keynote speaker, Mr. Lech Wałęsa, the Nobel Prize-winning leader of the Solidarity movement. Before he delivers his speech, I will say a few words on behalf of ODIHR. After Mr. Wałęsa's speech, we will hear from the OSCE Secretary General, Ambassador Thomas Greminger, followed by introductory remarks from my colleagues of the other two OSCE institutions, the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minority, Ambassador Lamberto Sanier, and the OSCE Representative on Freedom of the Media, Mr. Harlem Desir. They will be followed by Mr. George Serratelli, President of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, representing parliamentarians from the entire OSCE region. And followed will be some statements from the delegations of the participating states. But I just want to remind everybody that's the only delegations of the participating states that can deliver statements in the opening session. But I'm now pleased to give the microphone to our first speaker, Minister Miroslav Lajčák. The floor is yours, Minister.
Thank you very much, Madam Director. Good morning, dear Minister Čaputovič, Director Gisladottir, Secretary General Greminger, President Serratelli, High Commissioner Zanier, Representative on Freedom of the Media, Desir, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Many thanks to Poland for graciously hosting this annual meeting and ODIHR for organization and support. It is a very special occasion for me to open this meeting in such a symbolic year, marking the 30th anniversary of the extraordinary events of 1989. And our chairmanship is very honored to have President Wałęsa here with us, whose legacy attests that longing for peace and freedom exists in spite of unequal conditions, unconquered in all the peoples of the world. I was quoting now the words of the Nobel Commission while presenting the Nobel Peace Prize to President Wałęsa in 1983. 30 years ago, a wave of freedom swept across Central and Eastern Europe, and people demanded their freedom and human rights. This is a year to remind everyone that a desire for freedom, respect and dignity cannot be denied. And the story of the Helsinki Accords is especially powerful in this sense. When they were signed in 1975, many dismissed the ambitious human rights provisions as not worth the paper they were printed on, because obviously they would be disregarded. But the power of words was real. Principle 7, namely respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, including freedom of thoughts, conscience, religion, or belief, empowered people to talk openly about human rights and gave them center around which to organize and build networks. It helped people around Europe in their fight for dignity, demanding that words turn into action. That's really what this is still about, and why we are here today. To continue translating the words of human rights into facts on the ground, into the reality of people's everyday lives. In other words, to implement human rights. And I'm very glad that despite difficulties and after hard work, this meeting was made possible. Because this is a unique platform and we need to make use of it. And this is my first main message to you today. Here, we have the opportunity to engage meaningfully with civil society organizations, to listen to independent voices, to exchange information and good practices, but also an opportunity for all of us to account to our OSCE commitments. As our heads of states reiterated 20 years ago in Istanbul, and I quote, "Participating states are accountable to their citizens and responsible to each other for their implementation of their OSCE commitments," end quote. This one sentence is filled with meaning. First, we are responsible to our citizens. So I welcome the broad participation of civil society to the event and the possibility to live stream the discussions. And second, we are also responsible to each other. Review of implementing commitments is integral to any political action. And we all agreed already in 1991 in Moscow that commitments undertaken in the human dimension are matters of concern to all participating states. The only way to reconcile opposing views is to hear them out first. The open dialogue must continue, even on difficult issues. After all, the spirit of openness is the essence of HDIM. In this spirit, let us value all contributions, keep working where we agree, engage and reason where we disagree. But let us also take an honest look at where we are and what it took to get here. And the truth is, we could use some more constructive spirit. And that's my second message today. Despite the fact that HDIM is considered to be the largest human rights conference in Europe, we are putting its reputation in danger. Endless negotiations in Vienna, maximalist positions, lack of trust. Imagine how much time we could dedicate to substantive preparations for the meeting if we agreed on the agenda early, as envisaged by the decision adopted in 2002. Adopted by no other than us, participating states. Consequences of missing decisions are various, and they hit our reputation as well as our budget. They pose great burden on ODIHR and complicate efforts to organize the meeting successfully. And as we all know, for some time now, the work on the OSCE human dimension and HDIM has been seriously influenced by the discussion on the participation of civil society organizations. Our chairmanship has and will continue to seek dialogue to resolve issues of concern, so we can come to Warsaw and focus on the matter at hand. And that is to translate the words of Helsinki Act into reality for our people. And as long as there is any form of unfairness or injustice in our region, as long as our turbulent world brings new challenges to their freedoms, we need this forum. We need the conversations between states and civil society, and we need platform to have them. This is the place to be open, to be critical, but always respectful. HDIM is a pillar of the human dimension, and human dimension is the heartbeat of the Helsinki process. It might be referred to as the third, but it is in no way the last. And Helsinki process is one of the backbones of multilateralism. In a climate where human rights and multilateralism are under growing pressure, my final message to you is we need to seize on the fundamental rights ratified in Helsinki. We need to return to those provisions. History has already shown their potential, that they have a way of being translated into deeds. In turbulences and quick spins of events, as we are currently experiencing, sometimes it's good to go back to basics. Seize on proven solutions. Seize on Principle 7. Yet, since 2014, we have adopted only one decision in human dimension. It is high time for some of the proposal to get the ministerial seal. Our chairmanship will be listening very carefully here, exploring potential for the weeks to come. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I want to once again thank ODIHR for working hard to make the HDIM attractive and lively. There is almost 100 side events and informal discussions. And I will already take this opportunity to invite you to the first informal discussions tonight, namely the opening reception hosted by Poland and the Slovak OSCE chairmanship. I hope you all will fully use the time this meeting offers to generate constructive outcomes. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Minister Lajczak, for your clear and constructive message. And now I give the floor to the Foreign Minister of Poland, Mr. Jacek Czaputowicz. The floor is yours, Minister.
Mr. Secretary General, Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, Madam Director, Excellencies, distinguished guests, I am honored to welcome you to the annual Human Dimension Implementation Meeting in Warsaw. I would like to express my deep gratitude for the commitment and efforts of the OSCE chairperson in office and my dear colleague, Minister Miroslav Lajczak. It was Miroslav's excellent running of the chairmanship and his personal dedication which facilitated the consensus, thus leading to this year's conference. I would also like to thank the director of ODIHR, Ms. Indibjerg Isladottir, and her team for their work to organize the meeting, which undoubtedly constitutes a unique and most ambitious platform for dialogue on human rights issues in the OSCE region. Ladies and gentlemen, 30 years ago, in 1989, Poland's parliamentary elections sparked a wave of democratic and peaceful transformation across Central and Eastern Europe. This year, 30th anniversary is also closely linked to ODIHR's presence in Warsaw, dating back to the 1990s. Initially established as the Office of Free Elections, ODIHR continues to be perceived as a symbolic recognition of my country's pioneership with regard to restoring freedom, respect for human rights, and democratic order in Europe. We continue to take pride in hosting ODIHR in Warsaw. I wish to pay a special tribute to ODIHR's role in electoral assistance, strengthening democratic societies, as well as promoting tolerance and non-discrimination. We remain grateful for the excellent collaboration so far, and we look forward to many more years in good cooperation with ODIHR. In this context, we welcome the statement of the ODIHR's director, Madam Gisladottir, marking the first International Day commemorating the victims of acts of violence based on religion or belief. As you might be aware, I had the honor to introduce this initiative in the United Nations General Assembly. For the alarming growth in hostilities against members of religious groups remains of utmost importance for ensuring peaceful enjoyment of human rights worldwide. According to recent data, as much as 1/3 of the world's population suffers from some form of religious persecutions. Poland's commitment to protection of human rights is mainly driven by our firm belief in their universal applicability and the duty to protect them, which has been echoed in the priorities of my country's ongoing membership in the United Nations Security Council. Such approach also underpins our candidacy to the Human Rights Council for the term 2020-2022, where we intend to stand up for the rights of the child and the rights of persons with disabilities, as well as to support those searching for democratic transitions. Excellencies, dear delegates, OSCE is well known for promoting a comprehensive approach to security. It bridges the politico-military aspects of this domain with protection of human rights. The OSCE principles and rules, as enshrined in the Helsinki Final Act and the Paris Charter, have formed solid standards of conduct for the participating states towards its citizens and towards each other. Regrettably, 5 years ago, Russia's aggression against Ukraine violated the fundamental OSCE principles, such as the respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine and the illegal occupation of Crimea continue to pose the biggest challenge to our common security and to the OSCE itself. Let us be clear, the resolution of the Ukrainian conflict is absolutely essential in order to preserve the OSCE ability to build confidence and security. The cooperation in the human dimensions is pivotal for the OSCE cross-dimensional concept of security. By strengthening democratic institutions and fostering respect for human rights, we create the necessary conditions for a peaceful cooperation across the OSCE region. Mindful of this interdependence, I would like to reiterate Poland's full support for the mandate of the OSCE 3 autonomous institutions, which serve as reliable guardians of the participating states' commitments in the human dimension. Apart from ODIHR, I think of the High Commissioner on National Minorities and the representative on freedom of the media. Ladies and gentlemen, Poland, as the host country, has made every effort to make this year's Human Dimension Implementation meeting a success. We are also looking forward to the meeting in the Human Rights Directors format this afternoon, which we will be hosting jointly with the Slovak chairmanship in office. May I wish you that the upcoming 2 weeks yield fruitful discussions and practical recommendation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you for the reiteration of your clear support for ODIHR's presence here in Warsaw and the mandate of ODIHR. But Excellencies, Ministers, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, allow me to welcome you once again here to Warsaw and to the Stadium, to the Human Dimension Implementation meeting. We will shortly hear from Lech Wałęsa, our keynote speaker, who as leader of the Solidarity Movement played a crucial role in the events leading up to the establishment of ODIHR here in Poland. But before he speaks, I would like us to pause for a moment to consider just how astonishing it is that we are all sitting here together today. A meeting of these countries in this one room would have been unthinkable when I entered politics at the beginning of the 80s. In fact, I fully expected the world order I had grown up with, that it would remain unchanged throughout my lifetime. But this year, we celebrate the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, which ended the hostilities that for decades divided the world into East and West, and could at any moment have erupted into conflict, a conflict in which there would have been no winners. Of course, history did not end in 1989, as some forecast. Life moves on, and we face new challenges, both as nations and as individuals. But we are duty-bound to remember that time in order to do justice to all those millions of brave people who took part in the Velvet Revolutions that changed the world forever and for better. Ladies and gentlemen, it wasn't just the deeds, but also the optimism and the sense of community that characterized 1989 and the years that followed. But when I look back, I recognize with sadness just how much this is now lacking. For today, we are gripped by what seems to be an ever-deepening polarization in which some political leaders and their voters believe that anyone who disagrees with them or does not fit into their model of society is an enemy of the people, not worthy of respect. And the malaise goes still further, encompassing other groups from different regions, social backgrounds, or ethnicities. What saddens me even more is the fact that some politicians are irresponsibly fueling prejudice and hatred for the sake of short-term political gain. At the same time, they are increasingly embracing a disruptive approach, deliberately dismantling the fundamental pillars of the democratic system. The independence of the judiciary, freedom of the media, political and social pluralism, and a thriving civil society. Without these, there can be no democracy. But let us be clear, whatever promises are being made, nationalism, polarization, and hatred will never make a country or its population more secure or prosperous. Only equality between all the groups in society, women and men, young and old, ethnic minorities and the majority, all faith communities as well as non-believers, will have this effect. Unfortunately, this remains a remote goal. For on the contrary, in many places we are currently witnessing a gradual hollowing out of democracy from within. One of today's established democracies will probably not end with a bang in a revolution or a military coup. But if we don't protect, nurture, and promote it, democracy can end simply through the slow, steady weakening of the institutions that are its lifeblood, the removal of checks and balances, and the gradual erosions of standards. These threats to democracy are exacerbated by a lack of dialogue, both between and within our countries. The OSCE and ODIHR have dialogue written into their DNA, and that is with good reason. For when there is no longer space for open political debate, we are no longer far away from conflict. So, ladies and gentlemen, what can be done? Above all, we need to return to the understanding that democracy is not about friends and foes, winners and losers. It's about respect and trust, an acceptance of differing opinions, an exchange of views, and the willingness to share power and seek compromises. Politics should be a field which people want to participate in order to influence the country for the better. It gives me therefore great hope when I see the new movements of young activists, those demonstrating peacefully for their political rights, but also, for example, those fighting climate change. These young people are knocking at the doors of power with respect, but also determination. They have arguments and a finely tuned sense of justice on their side, and that is why they are being listened to. And it is precisely in these challenging times that we need to remember the many challenges the men and women who shaped history 30 years ago overcame. Let us reawaken the optimism of that time. After all, 60% of the world's countries are now democracies of one form or another, compared to only 40% at the beginning of the 1990s. That is an enormous achievement, and one of which we can be proud. And this, ladies and gentlemen, brings me to the commitments to which all participating states have signed up. They should not be regarded as a burden, but as an achievement and an opportunity. They make us aware not just of our rights, but how these rights form the building blocks of all truly just societies. It is also in a spirit of opportunity that we hold the Human Dimension Implementation Meeting, for which we are all gathered for the coming 2 weeks. Here we are all equal partners, with no one participating state more important than another. The very format of this conference is unique, bringing together so many representatives of government, civil society, international organizations, and many more for frank and constructive discussions that will help us face the challenges not just of today, but also tomorrow. Speaking openly and seeking consensus through dialogue is better not only for the people who live in our countries, but also for the future of the countries themselves. Ladies and gentlemen, I will end my remarks here. As well as wishing you fruitful discussions at this year's H-theme, I call on all participants to develop clear and concise recommendations for both participating states and for ODIHR and other OSCE bodies. As many of you know, these will be later drawn together in one document and form the basis for future talks and activities to strengthen the human dimension throughout the OSCE region. Thank you for your attention, and I now have the honor and pleasure to introduce you to our keynote speaker that I don't think I have to tell you what has achieved during his lifetime. It's really a pleasure and an honor, Mr. Valvensa, to give the floor to you. The floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, let me thank you from the bottom of my heart for this opportunity to speak to you. As you well know, I'm a revolutionary, and I am a rogue revolutionary, and my view and my perspective is often different from that of many theoreticians, many wise people of this world. Let me now also this time say what I mean, say what I think about the developments in Poland, Europe, and around the world. In my view, the fate of our generation has been of two major opportunities. The first major opportunity or area is to remove as many divides as possible within Europe and around the world, the divides that would hinder the growth and development in Europe and worldwide. There are the technologies that we developed up to a very high level, so our countries and our states cannot really go beyond that. Our grandfathers invented some technologies and they had to turn settlements into countries. And this arrangement lasted up until the end of the 20th century. When we invented so many technologies, well, we need to employ those technologies and expand the structures to apply them. And if we're talking about structures, we need to talk about programs as well. What I am going to tell you has been written down in many books, books written many years ago. Think about how far theoreticians were from practitioners. It was in the times of the Soviet Union, the divided Germany, the Warsaw Pact. And back in those times, there was a delegation from Germany that came to visit Poland, a high-level delegation with the Chancellor, Foreign Minister, and almost the entire German government. Mr. Genscher, back in those times and also today, I hold for the most important politician of that era. As a trade unionist, I held a meeting with that delegation. And I started speaking like a worker. And I said, "Dear sirs, are you ready? Because the Berlin Wall is about to collapse. Are you ready? Because the Soviet Union is about to collapse." And they were really confused, and they said, "What an outrageous idea." Then Mr. Genscher gasped and said, "Well, dear sir, we would like to have your problems. In our lifetime, this is never going to happen. Our graves will be covered by tall trees until that happens." So this delegation had to interrupt this official visit because this was the very moment when the Berlin Wall collapsed. So do not jump to conclusions, ladies and gentlemen. Like I said, Genscher was the greatest political talent of his time, but he was a professional. He had the wisdom of a professional, but he also knew history. He looked at arguments, pros and cons. He looked at the interest of those opposing blocs. And in his wisdom, he answered, "This is impossible. Only a nuclear war could change their reality." And Lech Wałęsa replied, "A Polish nation thinks practically, and we found a way to change the reality in a peaceful way." But this is history, and this is a proof to help you believe in what I'm trying to say. The second major area, which is an opportunity given to us by fate, is to build something better than what we have seen so far. But then again, theoreticians are looking for proper solutions in wisdoms, calculations, and the existing books, and they suggest something which is theoretically right. Whereas practitioners behave like you have been seeing in Poland and in the US, in many other countries. They want change. Nations want change. And they pressurize politicians for that change to happen. And they elect politicians that promise to make that change happen. And those politicians dig deep into history and suggest changes that have been proven to work well in history. However, for practitioners, for revolutionaries, for myself, a question arises, a very simple question. Now we are between two eras, between two epochs, the era of great divides. And thanks to Poland's solidarity and solidarity of the world, this era was put to an end. And we saw on the horizon an era of intellect and globalization and technology, a great opportunity to us all. However, this era calls for a change in all areas, spheres, and structures. All structures, including democracy, including freedom, they cannot match this coming era. We are somewhere in between, like I said, our generation, the successful generation of those times. And I call that era the era of words. First, there was a word, and word became flesh. And the word is something that happens during the meetings such as this one. So let's have as many such meetings as we can. Let's have discussions. Let's hold and hear arguments. Let's think about structures and programs. And let's meet people who have some ideas. And let's discuss and try to convince one another about solutions that we need for the coming times. Back in that era, countries developed different ideas for each. We are divided. We even profess different religions. But it's time to build broader structures. So to me, as a revolutionary, a question arises. What kind of foundations do we need for our new structure? Because each country rests on a different foundation. So you cannot build things that are very good. Well, we could introduce the euro, we could remove the borders in Europe, we can work in different countries, but there is a wall, and we are up against a wall. So what comes next? This is a big question about the foundation. So if I pose this problem at different meetings and different venues, the rooms would split into two equal parts. Some people want to build on liberties, free market, and the law. And they take the shortcut. Whereas others answer, you are not going to build anything. There is populism, there is demagogy, there is money, mercantilism. Sooner or later, this will lead you to a clash. Learn a lesson from your successes, victories, and history, and start building on values that you can agree upon. Once you have agreed upon 10 secular commandments, then the next question could be asked. What kind of economic system can we add to this new structure? Today, we're living in capitalism, and capitalism was well suited and it brought results. But it also involved rat race. So countries would race against one another without looking at their neighbors. Whereas today, we need a different perspective. We need to preserve a free market system and fix many of its aspects. What about our democracy? I was told some time ago that democracy wins with the majority. However, we have a majority who do not care to go to the vote. And I know what will happen next. Only the ones who are going to be elected will go to cast a vote, and others will skip the elections. Unless we organize our society differently, if we organize it in accordance to the different social strata. And we need to start doing this in this generation. And the third major problem, considering the condition when we challenge the great role of God, we are not afraid of our neighbors. So how can we now cope with demagogy, populism, and lies that we hear from politicians? But how do we do it in a structural way, in a serious, profound way? These are the three tasks for our generation. And only after they have been solved, and after we have found an agreement in the era of the world, can we start to build a new structure in a smart way. I ask upon you to believe me, a revolutionary, No other generation had the opportunity that we had to achieve peace, development, and welfare. But we need to align structures and programs in almost every area. And I am not talking about a revolution. I'm talking about minor alignments. We are living an era of dishonesty and war and mutual distrust. We can only start trusting each other once we have provided arguments to one another, convincing arguments that can be arranged together into wise structural and programming solutions. This is something I firmly believe in. I hear today, like I had in the past, Mr. Wałęsa, only a nuclear war could change the reality of this world. And today I also think that I believe in our generation, and I do believe that we are able to address and solve these problems. So let's hold discussions. Let's hear each other's arguments. The world is beautiful, but we have let all the disparities to arrive, all the harm to arrive, which will prevent us from a quick success. It will take some time, and our discussions will tell and determine how long it will last. So another question is, how much blood do we need? How many bruises do we need before we embark on a path to development? What we have seen today is being addressed by applying some retroactive solutions from old books, which is not the right way to go. This is what I wanted to share with you. I ask your forgiveness. I need to leave soon for Mexico to a similar meeting, and I'm going to deliver a similar speech. This is the only thing I can tell you. Thank you very much for your attention. I wish you fruitful discussion, and I firmly believe that you will find solutions, or you will move closer to the right solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Wałęsa, for being with us here and sharing with us your thoughts. You know, coming from your revolutionary background, a very practical approach to things. It's important for us to listen to you because, as you said, although we are living in an area of words now, deeds also have to matter, and that's what we have to get to, you know, to the deeds and to the actions. And thank you also for mentioning the importance of removing divides, as many divides as possible between the different countries, and to build something better based on that. Thank you again for being with us. And now I give the floor to the OSCE Secretary General, Ambassador Thomas Gremminger.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson, dear Ingeborg, Minister Lajčák, dear colleagues from the OSCE institutions and Parliamentary Assembly, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to take part in the opening of this year's Human Dimension Implementation meeting. This flagship OSCE event, convening now for the 28th year in a row, is Europe's largest gathering devoted to human rights. We just had the privilege to hear President Wałęsa share his personal perspective on the far-reaching impact of the Velvet Revolutions that brought about the collapse of communism in Central and Eastern Europe 30 years ago. One of their key legacies was the expansion in the early 1990s of the human rights mechanisms to protect the dignity of individuals and the right to exercise our fundamental freedoms. And HDIM is part of this legacy. HDIM's unique continuous dialogue brings together diverse voices from across the entire OSCE region. It enables civil society organizations and experts to engage directly and on equal footing with participating states. HDIM's spirited debates on the state of human rights and fundamental freedoms in our region remind us that the human dimension is essential to the work of the entire OEC family. Our comprehensive concept of security requires us all to consider how our actions affect the dignity of individuals throughout the OEC area. This obligation applies in the first instance to participating states who pledged in the Charter of Paris and in the Astana Declaration to promote and protect human rights and fundamental freedoms as their first responsibility, But it also applies to all parts of the OEC. The OEC institutions have the direct mandate and the principal responsibility for assisting participating states in implementing their human dimension commitments. But the rest of us, the Secretariat, field operations, and the Parliamentary Assembly must also ensure that all our activities are human rights compliant. This means that OEC efforts to combat terrorism, to secure borders, to improve policing, to counter trafficking in persons, to promote growth in the digital era. Indeed, all our activities comply with our shared commitments to promote human rights and fundamental freedoms, tolerance and non-discrimination, and respect for the rule of law. Dear colleagues, today, when human rights and fundamental freedoms are increasingly under threat in our region, HDIM is more important than ever. As we see backsliding on human dimension commitments in a growing number of participating states, it is increasingly clear that democratic institutions are fragile and that we must be ever vigilant in protecting them. Rapid technological change also poses new challenges to human rights and fundamental freedoms. While offering numerous benefits, technological innovations also create new vulnerabilities. And we are just beginning to understand its implications for the human dimension of security. Just to mention one example, digital technologies such as biometric screening, big data, and artificial intelligence can facilitate the work of human rights defenders, increase the transparency and accountability of governments, and help us track and apprehend terrorists and traffickers. But if not used properly, these technologies may infringe on privacy, jeopardize fundamental rights, or contribute to gender bias or discrimination against persons belonging to minority groups. These complex issues will be the focus of an OEC Security Days roundtable devoted to a human rights-centered approach to technology and security, which the Secretariat will convene in Vienna on the 8th of November in close cooperation with ODIHR and the other OEC institutions. Discussions will explore how technology can promote respect for human rights, democratic institutions, transparency and accountability, as well as how they can be used to counter security threats. And I would like to invite all HDIM participants to consider attending this event. Details will be available on the OEC website soon. Dear colleagues, especially when tensions are high and trust is low, increasing dialogue among participating states is critical. Indeed, dialogue is the key to rebuilding trust and reviving a sense of common purpose and a culture of cooperation. So we need to protect and promote our dialogue forums, including HDIM. Civil society is indispensable to finding effective solutions to the major security challenges all participating states face. We gain tremendously from civil society's expertise, the diversity of your perspectives and your activism. We need to hear your candid and even critical voices in our debates. And so it is imperative that OEC participating states, building on the good work in the informal working group, agree on a practical mechanism to resolve the current dispute over civil society organization access to HDIM and other OEC meetings. In today's world, threats to security are increasingly cross-dimensional. So we need cross-cutting and we need integrated approaches in which protecting the dignity of the individual is always a central element. And dear colleagues, it makes no sense to play the different dimensions off against each other. Instead, we should strive to strengthen OEC efforts in all three dimensions, including by modestly increasing the budgets of all OEC executive structures. And we must never forget that women's rights are human rights. This means there is no real security when women's rights are not respected. So I would like to draw your attention to this afternoon's side event on the well-being and safety of disadvantaged women, which has been organized by the OEC Secretariat's Gender Section. I would like to encourage you all to attend. In conclusion, I wish you fruitful and constructive discussions during the coming 2 weeks. And I hope you all return home to your work inspired to do even more to protect and to advance our precious human rights and fundamental freedoms. We all benefit from your efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. And now I give the floor to Ambassador Lamberto Zanier, the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities.
Thank you, Ingeborg. Good morning. Mr. Chairman in Office, dear colleagues, heads of institutions, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start by thanking Minister Lajčák and Director Gilesdottir for their commitment for the extensive efforts they put in place in ensuring that participating states reach agreement on working together in this HDIM, a truly unique forum that includes a frank exchange of views among participating states and between them and the civil society on implementation of human rights commitments. And the commitments undertaken by participating states in relation to rights of persons belonging to national minorities are obviously central to my conflict prevention work. Each year, my office is represented in a dedicated working session reviewing the implementation of these commitments. This year, for working session 12 on Tuesday next week, my staff will moderate a discussion focusing on the effective participation of national minorities in public life, taking a closer look at the effective participation of youth as well as women. Participating states identified youth as important actors since its very foundation in the Helsinki Final Act in 1975, when the CSE first expressed its commitment to promote the role and the inclusion of youth. 2 consecutive Ministerial Council declarations in 2014 and 2015 acknowledged the potential of young people to contribute to social development. In working session 12, we will outline why effective participation is more than a simple right, but a principle that also accompanies the implementation of all other rights affecting national minorities. Later this year in November, we will also mark the 20th anniversary of the HCNM Lund recommendations on the effective participation of national minorities in public life with an event that we are organizing in cooperation with the Lund University in Sweden. It will be a good opportunity to remind us all that promoting effective participation of all minorities in the society is still essential for any state that wants to maintain any kind of internal cohesion. It has a clear security dimension, and I encourage participating states to make sure that their policies take into account these recommendations. And I encourage civil society to monitor this process. Effective participation goes beyond the traditional realm of politics and decision-making processes. It extends to the cultural field and equally to socio-economic issues. I encourage consideration of this, an issue particularly significant for national minorities suffering from historical, persistent discrimination. The HCNM was established over 25 years ago as a conflict prevention mechanism, mandated to detect tensions related to ethnic relations that could potentially lead to conflict, and provide early warning to the wider OSCE. Experience has shown that the protection of human rights, and minority rights in particular, remains central to conflict prevention. And this understanding is well grounded in the OSCE comprehensive approach to security. More broadly, my office advises participating states on the long-term benefits of managing diversity through integration, including through the provision of tailored advice, as well as through constant reference to our general policy guidelines and thematic recommendations, which address the structural causes of conflict. I consider this relevant for all OSCE participating states. My team and I look forward to the discussions, side events and meetings during this year's conference. And from my side, I would like to thank you all in advance for your meaningful inputs over the next few days. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Sanier. I now give the floor to my good friend, Mr. George Serratelli, the President of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly.
Thank you very much, dear Ingeborg, Minister Lajcik, Secretary General Greminger, again, dear Director Gisladotir, dear Ambassador Zanir, dear Mr. Desir, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, and of course it was a pleasure to hear President Valensa's inspirational remarks. So Polish minister spoke today. Really, it's my pleasure again and honor to be here to speak on behalf of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. I think we have to admit that more than 4 decades after Helsinki final act, the struggle to respect and promote human rights and human security continues to be such a challenge. I think if we're honest, we would have to acknowledge that the past decade has represented a downward trend. This requires increased dedication and focus by all of us in this room. Let me echo previous speakers in thanking the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, and of course Slovak chairmanship, for organizing this very important annual event, in spite of continued disagreements in Vienna regarding this meeting. The consensus rule, and I've mentioned it many times during our different forums and meetings, which embodies the inclusiveness of our organization, has been the basis of OSCE's strength. We cannot allow it to become its weakness. Consensus should not stand in the way of strong and principled activities and decisions. We know that participation by civil society in OSCE meetings has been the subject of much discussion in recent years. This has also been the case within the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. At our flagship annual session in Luxembourg, we have addressed the square on. We have called our participating states to allow the chairman in office, in consultation with the Troika, as well as relevant OSCE institutions, the decision and discretion to rule on the validity of claims by representatives of participating states that an individual or non-governmental organization seeking to participate in an official OSCE event resorts to the use of violence or publicly condones terrorism or use of violence. We need to encourage greater civil society engagement in all OSCE activities. For the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, this has, for example, meant facilitating side events during our meetings, in addition to regular consultations when we have traveled to different countries and observe elections. These have often been inspiring opportunities to instill some grassroots energy in our work. We must do as much as we can to engage directly with civil society, not stifle their voices. As Chairman in Office Lajcik very rightly underlined earlier this year, dialogue, tolerance, and respect for cultural diversity and human rights are not just good for humanity, but can also act as key drivers of peace. While the OSCE has long acknowledged the need for stronger engagement with civil society, we have ourselves not always followed through on making this engagement sustained and effective. To remedy this is a new initiative, and there will be also some other initiatives I will share with you. I have asked Ms. Pia Kauma, she's here with us, an experienced member of parliament from Finland, to serve as special representative on civil society. And it's happening first time. We've never had special representative in this field. And work to identify concrete ways to enhance our cooperation to advance OSCE values for the benefit of the people we serve. Our Luxembourg Declaration, for instance, urges participating states to open sessions of the Permanent Council to public observation, including to live streaming on the internet. We're convinced that such efforts will not only contribute to hold participant states accountable for their policies, but also will demonstrate the continued relevance of multilateral engagement on human rights topics. Of course, more public interaction with NGOs will inevitably include criticism of certain OSCE countries. But we need to bear in mind that much like demonstrations and protests we can observe throughout the OSCE area, these are not foreign plots to attempts to undermine a government. Above all, these protests sometimes represent failure to be responsive to the concerns, needs and aspirations of our people. Because many countries of the OSCE region remain far from fully implementing our human dimension commitments, we need to encourage an open dialogue on controversial issues and between opposing voices. Ladies and gentlemen, the human rights dimension and human dimension is a central part of our work in the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, and we are proud to be able to offer a robust contribution also at this meeting. To strengthen our work here at HDIM and our overall engagement with civil society, the chair of the OSCP's Human Rights Committee, Mr. Hadjivanis, will tomorrow be hosting a side event to open a dialogue and on OSCPA priorities and work. The stronger engagement here in Warsaw has been reflected on the field than in our discussions over the past 12 months. Our Human Rights Committee has been extremely active working to shed light on the dire humanitarian consequences of the conflict in Ukraine. Our parliamentary field visits have been instrumental to rely on the urgent need for a sustained ceasefire and increase the mining activities in eastern Ukraine to put an end to the suffering of innocent civilians. We must continue to pursue the implementation of specific measures to facilitate freedom of movement along the contact line for civilians and encourage humanitarian gestures of goodwill, such as prisoner exchanges, in order to enhance the prospects for a political solution of the conflict. Of course, Ukraine is not the only OSCE country in which populations are suffering under conflict and occupation. We will also be familiar with the situation in my home country of Georgia, where so-called borderization and discrimination by the occupiers make daily life more and more difficult for a large part of Georgian population. In recognition of such challenges in several countries, the OSCPA recently called for a particular focus on the human rights of people in and affected by conflict areas and occupied territories. Our ad hoc committees on countering terrorism and on migration have continued to be active by conducting field visits, reaching out to international partners, and raising vital issues in national parliaments. This has contributed to replicate best practices and develop sound policies both for the short and long term. Distinguished guests, OSCE parliamentarians have continued to actively observe elections throughout our region to promote effective institutions. We continue to enjoy ever closer relations with our partners from the ODIHR, both at the leadership and staff level. The proliferation of unprofessional and biased election monitoring, often promoted by host governments and national parliaments, has in recent years had the unfortunate consequence on undermining public trust in election observation overall. We have continued to work hand in hand with Director Gisladotir and her team, as well as with our traditional partners in the European Parliament, the Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe, and the NATO Parliamentary Assembly to enhance the high value of the OSCE's election observation activities. Our organization possesses the unique asset recognized throughout the world. We must do all that we can to safeguard it. With that said, our practices are not immune to some criticism, and we have remained open to suggestions. In the past year, I'm proud that the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly reviewed the election observation practices to preserve the overall credibility of this exercise. Dear friends, dear colleagues, in times of increased polarization in our societies and our political discourse, we have seen more aggressive verbal attacks against activists and politicians online and the real world, sometimes with tragic implications. A fully functioning democracy requires that politicians, officials, and activists to be able to work without fear for their lives, nor fear of being imprisoned for their beliefs. Attacks on politicians or civil society representatives are nothing less than an attack on democracy. This is why it is so important that any political attack be investigated thoroughly, independently, and transparently. The investigation into the murder of Boris Nemtsov 4 years ago has left many questions unanswered. Based on a call by our Assembly members and Russian civil society representatives, for instance, Free Russia Foundation and others, I tasked Vice President Margareta Cederfeld from Sweden to carry out a report on the investigation. I believe it's important that we continue to raise the issue, not only for the memory of Boris Nemtsov and for his loved ones, but also to further guarantee the safety of politicians, lawmakers, and all those fighting daily to promote democracy and the rule of law. Everybody in this room will also recognize the need to protect those fighting against corruption. This is a scourge impacting all of our societies and undermines everything we try to achieve. In order to contribute to anti-corruption efforts and to consider how to protect those who are involved in this vital pursuit, I'm pleased to have recently appointed another my colleague from Cyprus, Serena Karlambidis, to lead OSCE PA contributions as my special representative. The difficult situation of journalists has also been a focus for OSCE parliamentarians. Noting the particular sensitivity of attacks against journalists, the OSCE PA recently called for effective parliamentary oversight of government actions on all cases of journalist murders, their imprisonment or ill treatment. Of course, this is only aspect of the challenges facing journalists. We have seen in many countries a narrowing space for critical opinions in the media, even when done under the cover of technically legal actions. This stifling of freedom of expression is an unacceptable trend that requires dedicated attention. I would like to underline the excellent work conducted by OSCE representative of freedom of media in countering the challenges. The search for truth also compels us to counter the dissemination or disinformation and propaganda that continues to pollute the media environment, polarize politics, and erode public confidence. To complement also the work of Harlem Desir in this particular challenge, I appointed last month Luca Santolini from San Marino as special rapporteur on this issue, that we can also identify more synergies in this field. Ladies and gentlemen, over the next dozen days, I expect many creative ideas and best practices to be presented here. Sincerely encourage all participants to seize this unique opportunity to learn from one another and take a deeper look at oneself. This forum should be seen as an opportunity for discussion and self-reflection, rather than an arena for finger-pointing and self-justifications. But of course, honest discussions and debates need a practical follow-up. We need political will to put all these ideas into practice. With this in mind, the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly looks forward to working with all of our partners around this table today to promote accountability and advance human security for all across the OSCE area. I wish you all a very successful session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. And now I give the floor to Mr. Arlem Desir, the OSCE representative on freedom of the media.
Thank you, Madam Director, dear Ingeborg, Mr. Chair, Mr. Secretary General, Mr. President of OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, Mr. High Commissioner for National Minority, Excellencies, distinguished representative of civil society organizations, ladies and gentlemen. First and foremost, I would like to thank ODIHR for their effort in organizing this year's conference and Poland for hosting us. It's a great pleasure to be in Warsaw again on this special year of 30th anniversary of the democratic history of Poland, with so many civil society organizations and representatives from the participating states. The conquest of freedom of the press was key in the event of the democratic revolution in Poland and in the Velvet Revolution in Europe in general. Many sessions and side events will be dedicated to media freedom during this first week, most of them during the first 3 days, actually, and I hope that we can take a thorough look at the situation of freedom of expression and media freedom across the OSCE region, and at the many challenges that journalists continue to face in their work. We live in a time where journalists and the press are not only facing the challenges of digital transformation, fake news and disinformation, they are still besieged by intimidation, threats and attacks of many kinds. However, sometimes there is also good news, and for once I would like to begin with this. In the past few days and weeks, we have seen the release of an author and of several journalists that we, as an institution, as many of the civil society organizations here, have been defending for a long time. Just last week in Turkey, the Cumhuriyet journalist Musa Kart, a well-known cartoonist, Gürey Hoz, Hakan Kara, Önder Çelik, and Mustafa Kemal Güngör, their colleagues, were released after the Supreme Court of Appeal overturned their sentences. I am relieved by this decision. They should never have spent so much time behind bars, and I hope that this momentum will be used to release all other journalists and media workers in prison for their work in the country, including Emre Ayper, the accountant of the newspaper. A few days earlier, on 7 September, it was Kirill Vyshinsky, the RIA Novosti chief bureau in Kyiv, Roman Sushenko, a Ukrainian journalist from Ukraine Forum, and Oleg Sentsov, the well-known author, who were released in Kyiv and Moscow. And I think that this shows that we must never lose hope, that we must never renounce to raise situations, to pronounce the name of the concerned journalist, and that through dialogue and with political will, progress is possible. But many other journalists are still detained in the OSCE region, including in some of the mentioned participating states, and we still have a lot to do. Last year, the Ministerial Council adopted a landmark decision on safety of journalists. In this decision, the 57 ministers doesn't only raise the issue of physical safety, I will return to this, but they also say, I quote, that they urge the immediate and unconditional release of all journalists who have been arbitrarily arrested or detained, taken hostage, or who have become victims of enforced disappearance. I call all participating states to implement this ministerial decision and to release all concerned journalists. I noted in my latest report to the Permanent Council last July that in the past 7 months, I intervened on 121 individual cases of detention and imprisonment of journalists and media workers in our region. This is an alarming situation, which has to be urgently addressed. No journalists in our region should be imprisoned because of their reporting, investigation, or critical opinion. It's time to protect the legal safety of journalists as we will protect their physical safety. Physical safety is still at risk, and we have seen too many instances of physical harassment, threats, and violent attacks against journalists in an attempt to intimidate or silence them in the past year since the last HDIM. By adopting the Ministerial Council decision, which I mentioned on safety of journalists last December, all 57 participating states confirmed that safety of journalists is our shared goal and that we need to urgently act on improving it and combating impunity. My office and I are looking for more practical steps to support the urgent implementation of these commitments. We are here today to defend media freedom and safety of journalists because when they are assaulted, it's not just a profession which is at risk. It is the right of the citizen to be informed. It is the existence of a public space for diverse and critical opinions. It is the possibility to hold those in power accountable. It is democracy itself. We live in a time of profound transformation of the information sphere, which opens many opportunities, but also fragilizes the business model of the press, the survivance of many newspapers and newsrooms, the possibility for journalists to provide reliable and quality information. In the age of disinformation, of fake news, we need more than ever professional and ethical journalism as a pillar of democracy. And that's why we need to protect free, independent, and diverse media. And that's why we must work tirelessly to implement the OSCE commitments of the enabling right of freedom of expression and media freedom. That's why I'm looking forward to our rich and frank exchanges this week, and I thank you for your attention. I wait for you in the side events and the many sessions that we will be organizing. Thank you.
Thank you, Arlene. This concludes the opening statements, and I thank all my colleagues for their contribution here. And now we have reached the part where we will listen to the statements of delegations from participating states. And I just want to remind everybody that the number of speakers on the speakers list determines the time for each statement, and we have now calculated that the speaking time is limited to 3.5 minutes for each speaker in order so we can finish this session in time. 3.5 minutes for each of the statements. And I have now 23 delegations on my list, and the first one to deliver a statement is Ukraine, and followed by Kazakhstan.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairperson, dear Ingeborg, President Tsereteli, Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen. We thank the ODIHR and the Polish host, as well as the Slovak chairmanship, for organizing this important annual Human Dimension meeting, and for the warm hospitality we all enjoy. From the very outset, I would like to align with the statement of Minister Jacek Czaputowicz, and in particular on the issue of the Russian military aggression against my country. Human dimension stays at the core of comprehensive security in the OSCE region. ODIHR, for its part, remains a guardian of the implementation of commitments and internationally recognized election observation standard-setting institution. We express sincere gratitude to Director Gisladottir, Ambassador Styler and Johnson for leading the largest international election observation mission and their professional work in organizing an independent monitoring of the 2019 regular presidential and early parliamentary elections in Ukraine. Their findings reflect a strong commitment of Ukraine to democracy and human rights through the conduct of free and fair elections in line with the national legislation, OSCE commitments, and other international standards. Constructive criticism is taken on board. Distinguished delegates, today's Europe is saturated with various human rights events taking place in Geneva, Strasbourg, Vienna, Warsaw, elsewhere. Unfortunately, some of these actions have no or little traction with the realities on the ground. War in the heart of Europe, attempted annexation of a country's territory, illegal elections in the occupied territories of Georgia and Ukraine, crisis of migrants and IDPs. Has the reaction of the OSCE or any other European human rights bodies, if any, helped the people whose human rights and fundamental freedoms had been violated? Instead of jointly developing specific solutions to real problems, oftentimes we spend our precious time fighting with gongos who clutter important discussions with genuine civil society and human rights defenders and penetrate various institutions as malware penetrates our computers. Real traction will be gained if all 57 OSCE participating states, of which 47 are members of the Council of Europe, and all are members of the United Nations, implemented fully their legal obligations under international human rights instruments and applied international legal standards of human rights protection. It is unacceptable, we believe, when we face situations of brutal human rights violations that political considerations take over, threatening the rule and standard-based European order. It comes to the point of absurdity that when we have to address serious human rights abuses, there appears to be a red line about the, quote, absence of consensus on the status of a given territory, as if the Helsinki Final Act and international law ceased to exist. Madam Chairperson, as we prepare for a 2-week marathon of discussion of implementation of our political commitments, I shall reduce my remarks and conclude by reminding all of us that human rights should not become victims of political considerations, but they should be subject to meticulous implementation of undertaken legal obligations. And then there are still people in our continent for whom fighting for their fundamental human rights and fundamental freedoms is a daily struggle for survival. We cannot afford to let them down. We cannot afford all action and no traction. The full text of my statement as prepared will be posted online. And I thank you, Madam.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to the delegation of Kazakhstan, followed by Finland on behalf of the European Union.
Thank you, Chair. Dear high dignitaries from the OSCE, Excellencies, friends, ladies and gentlemen. Since the election of President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, who is a career diplomat, in June 2019, the government has been introducing concrete steps in the direction of social, political, and economic development in Kazakhstan. The initiatives are aimed at both enhancing the living standards of the population as well as at modernizing the political system in the country. During his recent address to the nation, President Tokayev stated that the government will carry out political reforms, adding that successful economic reforms are no longer possible without the modernization of the society's social political life. Political developments, right to protest. President Tokayev stated that citizens will have greater rights to hold peaceful rallies in key locations, not just on the outskirts of the cities. He said that protests should be embraced as long as they are peaceful and lawful. This has already been implemented. Protesters were free to demonstrate during recent marches in several regions of Kazakhstan and the city of Almaty. Nobody was detained, despite the fact that some protests were unauthorized. Local officials engaged with the demonstrators and discussed with them their grievances. Dialogue. In his address to the nation, the president spoke about the need to ensure a state that listens, which quickly and efficiently responds to all constructive citizens' requests. The department has been created in the presidential administration that will monitor how state bodies review citizens' requests. If miss wrongdoing, they will be fired. In addition, people will be more involved in the lawmaking process. For example, a National Council of Public Trust has been established that will make policy recommendations based on the input from the public, political parties, and civil society. This body has already had its inaugural sitting in August 2019. Justice reforms. President Tokayev stated that judicial and law enforcement reforms must be implemented and a thorough analysis of court decisions should be carried out. Steps have already been taken in this direction. For example, measures are being taken to punish those who used torture in the prison in the town of Zarechnoye. Furthermore, trade union leader Irlan Baltabay, who was initially given a 7-year sentence, was released in August. Meanwhile, political activist Serikjan Belash, who faced 7 years imprisonment, was also freed in August. Law and order in the protection of rights. The President stated that all contradictions and ambiguities of the legislation should be interpreted in favor of citizens. Furthermore, he announced that urgent action will be taken to tighten the penalties for those who commit serious crimes, including sexual violence, drug trafficking, human trafficking, domestic violence against women, and serious crimes against individuals, especially children. In addition, urgent measures, including tightening legislation, are being taken to tackle poaching. Economic developments, support for the private sector. The President announced that from January 2020, there will be a 3-year ban on inspections of micro and small businesses, as the government wants to promote the integrity and law-abiding nature of Kazakh business. Furthermore, the government is developing a legal framework to exempt micro and small businesses from paying taxes on their main activities for 3 years. Elimination of corruption. President Tokayev has made this one of the top priorities of the government. Improving living standards, enhancing living standards, including through increasing population's income, creating new jobs, and providing available affordable housing. Social development, unity and ethnic harmony. President Tokayev has taken a firm course towards further uniting the nation during his inaugural speech on 10 June. He stated, "There is only one homeland for us. Our destiny is common." Human development. Another key priority for the government announced by President Tokayev is the sustainable development of human capital.
Mr. Speaker, can I just ask you to conclude your speech?
For example, over the next 4 years, teachers' salaries will double, and next year their salaries will increase by 25%. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to Finland on behalf of the European Union, and after that Sweden. And I will remind everybody to stick to the time limits. That is 3.5 minutes for each speaker.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. I pass the floor to the Ambassador of the European Union.
Thank you very much. North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, and Iceland align with the statement. And as always, Madam Director, I will seek your understanding and that of other delegates. We may go a little over the time limit, but we do believe we're making you a favor by delivering this one single statement on behalf of 32 countries. We express sincere appreciation to the Slovak chairmanship and ODIHR for the excellent preparation of this meeting, the most important event in the OSCE human dimension, which allows for a genuine and frank dialogue amongst participating states and with members of civil society. We express strong support for the 3 autonomous institutions. We play an important role in assisting the participating states to implement their commitments. We remain firmly committed to strengthening the rules-based international order grounded in human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, which are foundational values of the EU, and to fully supporting multilateralism. This is illustrated by our active commitment, by our active engagement in HDIM, which offers an opportunity not only to listen to independent voices and exchange information, but above all, for all of us to be held to account regarding our commitments. We cannot take human rights for granted. Many struggles for more liberty and freedom are still taking place across the world, in the OSCE area in particular. Violations and abuses represent serious challenges to our comprehensive security. Space for civil society continues to shrink. The safety of journalists is being undermined as part of a wider attack on freedom of expression, including through hate crime online. We're experiencing a backlash in women's rights and gender equality. Cyber violence against women and girls is increasing. Torture and other ill treatment are amongst the most abhorrent violations of human rights and dignity. We commend all individuals and organizations that work tirelessly to ensure that human rights be respected. Support for human rights defenders is at the core of the EU's external human rights policy, and we will keep being at the side of those who stand up for human rights every day. On specific country situations, we remain deeply concerned about the dire situation of human rights and the systematic restrictions of fundamental freedoms in Crimea and Sevastopol since its illegal annexation by Russia. We condemn the systematic persecution of the Crimean Tatar community. The precarious situation of persons belonging to national minorities on the peninsula is shameful. We reiterate our unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We remain firm in our call on all sides to swiftly and fully implement the Minsk Agreement. We underline Russia's responsibility in this regard and again call on it to exert influence over the armed formation it backs to meet those commitments in full. We furthermore call for full access of all humanitarian organizations to the non-government controlled areas. We welcome the commitments of Ukraine's new leadership to address the socio-economic and humanitarian consequences of the conflict in an inclusive manner and stand ready to engage with Ukraine to support this momentum. We remain concerned about the ongoing crackdown on civil society in Russia, the curtailing of rights and freedoms, the repression against opposition, and the shrinking space for independent media. The increasing restrictions on freedom of expression are mirrored by persistent use of disinformation as a destabilizing tool. The exercise of human rights in digital contexts appears to be increasing under threat. A series of laws affecting freedom of speech on the internet in Russia have been recently adopted, with an acceleration in the last year. We also raised our concern regarding violations of freedom of religion or belief, including the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses and instances of politically driven persecutions of regular citizens who participate in peaceful protests in order to intimidate them. We have repeatedly expressed concerns about the arrests, attacks, intimidations, and discrediting of human rights defenders and journalists working in the Chechen Republic. The recent release from detention of Oyub Titiev contributes to redressing a serious injustice and is testimony to the work and solidarity of Russian and international civil society activists and legal experts. We continue to follow the case of Yuri Dmitriev and call for his immediate release. Our concerns about reports of arrests, unlawful or arbitrary detention, torture, and killings of people in Chechnya based on their actual or alleged sexual orientation remain unanswered, and the human rights situation continues to fall below Russia's OSCE commitments and international obligations. We continue to be concerned about the human rights situation and fundamental freedoms in Azerbaijan. The presidential pardoning on Nowruz holidays was a welcome step. We reiterate, however, our call to release journalist Afgan Mukhtarli and encourage Azerbaijan to review all remaining cases of incarceration, to release all imprisoned political activists, and to fully restore their political rights in line with international commitments. We continue to share RFOM's concerns regarding laws and regulation affecting media. Likewise, we call on Azerbaijan to create conditions allowing citizens to exercise fully the freedom of assembly. The EU recalls its strong opposition to capital punishment in all circumstances and calls on Belarus to introduce a moratorium on the use of the death penalty as a first step towards abolition. We fully support the appeals of the RFOM to Belarus to undertake the reforms necessary. We also call on Belarus to amend legislation regarding freedom of assembly and to follow ODIHR's recommendation in order to ensure free and fair elections. We continue to follow with great concern the deeply worrying backsliding in Turkey with regards to human rights and fundamental freedoms, democracy, and the rule of law. Exercise of freedom of expression has been considerably hampered in recent years, and heavy pressure on journalists and the media continues with more than 160 journalists in jail. Space for independent civil society is shrinking dangerously. Turkey's legitimate fight against terrorism cannot justify the repeated arrests of elected local politicians, as well as civil society representatives, journalists, lawyers, academics, and other critical voices, or other violations of human rights. We call on Turkey to respect human rights, guarantee fundamental freedoms, and ensure a safe, pluralistic, and enabling environment for the media and civil society to carry out their work independently and without fears of reprisals. We are concerned about the continuous deterioration of the human rights situation in the Georgian regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, affecting in particular ethnic Georgians, the ongoing violations of freedom of movement, the restrictions of property rights and education in native language, as well as the severe obstacles to the rights of displaced persons. And we reaffirm our full support for Georgia's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We welcome recent political reforms in some countries of Central Asia, which are having positive outcomes for human rights. I've got two last paragraphs. having positive outcomes for human rights compliance, while encouraging countries of the region where serious human rights violations persist to achieve tangible reforms for the promotion and protection of human rights. We call on Central Asian authorities to stop arbitrary extension of prison sentences and unlawful restrictions of fundamental freedoms. We remain seriously concerned about the fate of people subject to enforced disappearances in Turkmenistan's prisons and call on Turkmenistan to take action and eradicate this scourge. Madam Chair, no region is immune from facing challenges in the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms, nor is the EU. Several challenges do exist, and we remain committed to addressing them. We look forward to a constructive meeting, engaging with the representatives of all participating states and civil society. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to Sweden, followed by Norway.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sweden aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union, but I'd also like to say a few words in a national capacity. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the freedom to choose, speak, think and love can never be taken for granted. Therefore, it gives me great pleasure to say a few words about the Swedish government's recently launched focus area called Drive for Democracy. Its purpose is to initiate a renewed effort to support and strengthen democracy worldwide. The background is our growing concern about threats to democracy. Around the world, authoritarian leaders are gaining ground. Democratic principles and values are being threatened. Freedom of expression and association are on the decline. Democratic institutions are being weakened, and the democratic space for civil society is shrinking. The Drive for Democracy aims to respond to these developments. The initiative extends across foreign and security policy, development cooperation, as well as trade and promotion. Let me give you 4 quick examples. First, Sweden will stand up for democratic principles in all contexts, work to ensure that democracy is strengthened, and voice criticism against democratic deficits or risks of backsliding. Second, we are stepping up our democracy assistance. This is already one of the main areas of Swedish development cooperation, but we are now redoubling our efforts in light of the current situation. This includes support to democratic processes and election authorities, fighting corruption, but also to free and independent media and democratic voices such as civil society and human rights defenders. Human rights and the rule of law are intrinsically linked to inclusive and democratic societies and are therefore key elements also when strengthening democracy. Third, Sweden seeks to build new alliances to promote democracy worldwide. We need to strengthen the political engagement for democracy and together with others share good practices and experiences of why we believe democracy is the best governing system. Fourth, we are convinced that an equal society is a prerequisite for ensuring a well-functioning democracy. Without everyone enjoying equal opportunities and access to welfare, genuine participation in democracy is impossible. Increased social gaps prevents democracy to grow. And fifth, as I already alluded to, democracy cannot flourish without respect for human rights. The Drive for Democracy is rights-based, and Swedish support to improved enjoyment of human rights, such as freedom of expression, assembly and association, is a central feature of this initiative. And finally, gender equality is central to democracy, and the Drive for Democracy and Sweden's feminist foreign policy are mutually reinforcing. One important area where we will increase our attention and support is women's access to the political arena and their active participation in society building. Now, Swedish embassies and missions around the world play a key role in the design, implementation, and impact on the Drive for Democracy. However, as conditions vary between countries and contexts, our embassies and missions are encouraged to build on ongoing and planned activities and contacts and add new aspects that align with the direction of the Drive for Democracy. The Drive for Democracy is a key focus area for my government, and we will work intensely in the coming years to provide much needed support to democracy's institutions, to its processes, and to its defenders. As I said, democracy cannot be taken for granted, and we must act decisively to defend it every day. A full version of this statement will be submitted for document distribution later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to the delegation of Norway, followed by Germany.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Human Dimension Implementation Meeting is important. The lessons learned and experiences exchanged here are preserved by ODIHR in its role as a steward of HDIM. This is but one aspect of ODIHR as an essential institution for the promotion of democracy, rule of law, human rights, tolerance, and non-discrimination. Democracy and the rule of law is under threat in our region. There are continuing signs of democracy being persistently undermined. Strong and viable democracies should be a hallmark of Europe and the entire OSCE region. Fully democratic societies require more than free and fair elections. Elections mean little when there is no real opposition, and democracy requires rule of law and effective checks and balances. An independent judiciary is essential. So too are free media and a safe and enabling environment for the exchange of information and ideas. And democracy requires the full and effective participation in public life of both women and men. The imperative of equality for all is necessary for the full realization of the human rights. We must continue to stand up for equal opportunities as well as the empowerment, inclusion, and participation of women and girls. We need autonomous institutions to safeguard the rights of all individuals and support states in their implementation. The autonomy of ODIHR allows it to offer impartial, professional advice and support, and to hold us to our commitments. The success of ODIHR depends upon participating states recognizing the importance of protecting and maintaining its autonomy. We remain concerned about the negative trends in the working conditions for the media and sharp increase in hostile rhetoric, harassment, and hate speech and attacks on journalists in a number of participating states. Journalists and media workers face great risks in order to disclose corruption and abuse of power, to expose violations of human rights, and provide the public with information. And we must ensure that journalists are safe and enjoy rightful protection in the OSCE area. We value the presence of civil society organizations at this meeting. Human rights defenders help strengthen the respect for human rights in our region. Standing up for human rights in the face of danger and repression requires tremendous courage, especially when governments, whose responsibility it is to protect and implement these rights, impose laws and policies that do the opposite. And we commend and applaud the work of the human rights defenders and look forward to hearing their recommendations. However, some organizations are here for other purposes. Some use HDIM to reproduce propaganda under the guise of independence. Others express intolerant views under the guise of defending the principles of free expression, tolerance, and non-discrimination. These insincere statements are easily recognized, and they add nothing of value to our deliberations. The voices of civil society, truly speaking in defense of human rights and fundamental freedoms, are as important as ever. They enable real debate on our efforts, or lack thereof, to implement all commitments in the OSCE's human dimension. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I have Germany, followed by Uzbekistan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me start by thanking ODIHR and the Slovak chairmanship for preparing and organizing Europe's largest conference on human rights. And I also want to thank the EU ambassador for the statement on behalf of the member states, and I also will add some remarks on my national capacity. In the 1991 Moscow document, we, the participating states, categorically and irrevocably declared that the commitments undertaken in the field of the human dimension are matters of direct and legitimate concern to all participating states and do not belong exclusively to the internal affairs of the states concerned. Ladies and gentlemen, during the next 2 weeks, we have to transform these words into action, working with NGOs, we will address the challenges of implementing these commitments and exchange views on important aspects of the human dimension. Active civil society participation is the basis for the meeting's unique character and success. Civil society is and will have to remain part of this dialogue. We believe that broad participation by members of civil society is vital in order to strengthen and implement human rights and rule of law standards across the OSCE region. We welcome the fact that participating states were able to agree on the meeting agenda this year. Looking ahead, we hope that this consensus prevails. Germany plays an active part in the OSCE's work. We are second largest financial contributor, support extra budgetary projects in all three dimensions, and share our experience and expertise by seconding personnel. We are glad to support ODIHR's activities in areas such as the rule of law, good governance, human rights, the strengthening of civil society, and election observation. We also grant sizable extra budgetary funding to projects that address specific issues such as the fight against anti-Semitism, freedom of speech and the media, the protection of national minorities and tolerance, and non-discrimination. These issues remain particularly close to our heart. As an elected member of the UN Security Council in 2019 and 2020, Germany attaches great importance to the preventive aspects of human rights. In our view, the Security Council needs to address human rights violations as part and parcel of its responsibility for maintaining international peace and security. During our presidency in April, we therefore undertook several initiatives to increase the Council's focus on human rights, including by inviting UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, to a Council meeting, initiating the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 2467 on combating sexual violence in conflict, and inviting a record number of female civil society briefers to Security Council meetings. If we are re-elected to the United Nations Human Rights Council for the coming 3 years, we would like to make use of our concurrent membership of the Security Council and the Human Rights Council in 2020 to bring the security dimension and the human rights dimension even closer together in our UN work. As the OSCE's gold standard in applying a comprehensive security concept serves us as a best practice example. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. And now I have Uzbekistan on my list, followed by United States of America.
Madam Chair, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, currently democratic reforms in Uzbekistan is being done to ensure the protection of human rights. I would like to highlight our constructive partnership with the OIC structures on human rights issue as well as with ODIHR. In my remarks, I would like to indicate new trends in our activity in human rights. First, last year in November, the Asian Forum on Human Rights was held in Samarkand, which was organized the first time in the 70 years of the creation of the UN on the Asian continent. I would like to highlight the personal participation of Madame Gisladottir and Her Excellency Tsereteli in the work of the forum. During the forum, there was signed the Memorandum of Understanding between OIC, ODIHR, and the Parliament of Uzbekistan. In Asian Forum, we adopted Samarkand Declaration on Human Rights, and this document was approved as an official document of the 73rd session of United Nations General Assembly. Second, during the 72nd session of the UN General Assembly, President of Uzbekistan was initiated the development on the UN International Convention on the Rights of Youth. We have prepared an initial draft of the convention, as well as we began to discuss it with our partners. Third, we reaffirm the nomination of our candidate for election to the Human Rights Council for the period 2021-2023. Uzbekistan has prepared voluntary commitments and pledges pursuant the UN General Assembly Resolution 60/251. Fourth, the OSCE provides active assistance in the examination of draft laws, especially the recommendations of the OEC ODIHR have been taken in the development of the new electoral code. The OIC project coordinated in Uzbekistan are being implemented joint projects that aim at improving the activities of state bodies on human rights and promoting civil society institutions, as well as conducting educational programs on human rights. This December, Uzbekistan will hold regular elections to parliament, and we're waiting a full-fledged observation mission of OEC ODIHR and other our international organizations. And fifth, this week we are waiting the visit of the special rapporteur on the independence of judges and lawyers, Mr. Diego Garcia Sayan, to Uzbekistan. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to the Ambassador of the United States of America, followed by Serbia.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. I'm James Gilmore, the new U.S. Permanent Representative to the OSCE. It's my honor to join you in these important discussions. HDIM discussions go to the heart of OSCE's comprehensive security concept, which teaches us for respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. This is a principle that was put forward at the beginning of my country in the United States, the Declaration of Independence, drafted by my fellow Virginian Thomas Jefferson. States that violate and abuse the human rights of their own people are likely to be equally callous about lives of people beyond their borders. Rule of law is a fiction when the law is used as a political weapon. Leaders who do not respect the rule of law at home appear most willing to violate the sovereignty and territorial integrity of other countries. In the OSCE region, we see this in Russia's ongoing aggressive actions against Ukraine, which have caused the worst security crisis in Europe since the 1990s. Almost 13,000 people have been killed and 2 million driven from their homes in eastern Ukraine. In Russia-controlled areas of eastern Ukraine, those considered to have pro-Ukrainian sympathies are subject to imprisonment, extreme physical abuse, and killings. In occupied Crimea, authorities arrest, detain, and prosecute Crimean Tatars and other Ukrainians, and any others who dare to reject Russia's attempt to annex this peninsula. As Secretary of State Mike Pompeo affirmed in his 2018 Crimea Declaration, the United States will maintain Minsk-related sanctions against Russia until it fully implements its Minsk commitments. Crimean-related sanctions will remain in place until Russia returns full control of the peninsula back to Ukraine. We stand with Ukraine as it implements the anti-corruption and other reforms necessary to realize its European aspirations. My government welcomes the September the 7th prisoner exchange between Russia and Ukraine, which led to the release of 35 Ukrainians, including the 24 members Russia seized in its November 2018 attack on the Kerch Street, and filmmaker Oleg Sentsov. We hope this is only a first step towards a constructive path to Russia's relations with its neighboring countries. 20 years after Russia committed to withdraw its military forces from Moldova, its military forces remain on Moldovan territory without Moldova's consent. We call on Russia to suspend its occupation of 20% of Georgia's territory, withdraw its forces to pre-conflict positions, and allow unhindered access for the delivery of humanitarian assistance in accordance with its commitment under the 2008 ceasefire agreement. We call for the immediate halt and dismantling of fencing and other barriers along the administrative boundary lines. The United States is committed to working with other participating states and civil society to counter Russia's disinformation and other malign influence. We condemn Russia's detention of those peacefully protesting the rejection of candidate registrations for the Moscow city elections. Since last year's HDIM, Russia has used its law on undesirable foreign organizations to intimidate and arbitrarily prosecute, fine, and in some cases arrest Russian human rights defenders, reporters, and media outlets. Having classified Jehovah's Witnesses as extreme organization, Russian authorities jailed or placed under arrest over 60 of them and has imprisoned nearly 230 persons for religious belief, most of whom are Muslims. In Berlin in 2004, the participating states recognized that anti-Semitism and other forms of intolerance pose a risk to democracy, the values of civilization, and therefore to overall security in the OSCE region and beyond. In all countries, including my own, we should be willing to prosecute those who commit crimes against their fellow citizens who are driven by hate or other motivation. In America, we're taking vigorous action to prosecute those who attack synagogues or Jewish citizens. There's no room for crimes of hate or violence against anyone, anywhere, for any reason. There's never any justification for anti-Semitism, for anti-Muslim and anti-Christian discrimination, for anti-Roma and other racial or ethnic intolerance, or for criminalizing sexual orientation. For all the troubling trends in our region, Madam Chairman, there are also some positive developments. We've been pleased to see several participating states hold generally free and fair elections in the past year.
Speaker of the time limits.
And we welcome the steps some states have taken to expand religious freedoms from the fear of one's own. Madam Chairman, I conclude by saying 44 years ago, President Ford concluded his speech in Helsinki by reminding his fellow Final Act signatories, history will judge the conference not by what we say, but by what we do tomorrow, not by promises we make, but by promises we keep. In conclusion, I express my delegation's deep respect for the human rights defenders who have journeyed from across the region to participate in this conference, perhaps at great risk of reprisal. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to the delegation of Serbia, followed by the Czech Republic.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. At the outset, I would like to express appreciation to the Slovak chairmanship for its dedicated efforts to convene this year's Human Dimension Implementing Meeting, the Office for the Democratic Institution and Human Rights for its preparation, and our Polish hosts for their hospitality. As one of the largest annual human rights forums, the OSCE Human Dimension Implementation Meeting presents a valuable platform for an open dialogue between participating states and civil society representatives on the key challenges we are facing in implementation of our human dimension commitments, which have a clear impact on the security in the OSCE area. In the Astana Commemorative Declaration, the OSCE participating states confirmed that the inherent dignity of an individual is at the core of the comprehensive security, that human rights and fundamental freedoms are inalienable, and that their protection and promotion is a first responsibility. It is a duty to safeguard, strengthen, and promote the human rights standards and norms that we all agreed upon. Fundamental human rights and freedoms are most affected in times of conflicts and crisis. Consequently, it is necessary to invest all possible efforts to find peaceful and sustainable solutions for existing and growing challenges, rebuild trust and confidence within the entire OSCE region, and confirm our dedication to promote and respect human dimension commitments. Let me also highlight the important role of the OSCE institution in assisting participating states in addressing challenges and implementing the human dimension commitments. Their work is one of the cornerstones of the OSCE human dimensions, and their respective mandates and capacities should be fully utilized, thus contributing to foster peace and security. In these challenging times, when threats to security are largely present in the entire OSCE region, only strong, independent, and professional institutions can help us to properly address issues and accumulated problems. Taking into account divergent views on the works of some OSCE institutions, we have to work jointly in order to overcome divisions and mistrust. Over the years, Serbia has benefited from close cooperation with all OSCE institutions. We appreciate the synergy between them, and we recognize and respect the valuable assistance they have provided us in addressing challenges in areas such as the rule of law, freedom of expression, and freedom of the media, including protection of journalists, protection of rights of persons belonging to national minorities, as well as rights of refugees and internally displaced persons, democratization and improvement of electoral processes, tolerance and non-discrimination, and freedom of assembly and association, all of which have been high on the agenda of the Serbian government in previous years. Furthermore, we consider that strengthening links with civil society and promotion of its active involvement would contribute to further implementation of OSCE commitments in the third dimension. Their participation in the OSCE events alongside the representatives of the participating state is of great value. Therefore, we encourage all participating states to have a constructive debate on relevant OSCE modalities of participation of civil society representatives to the OSCE activities, and particularly to human dimension events, in order to achieve concrete results and to improve the effectiveness of the organization. Finally, we would like to call upon all participants at these meetings to contribute to a fruitful dialogue and provide concrete recommendations, and we look forward to a constructive spirit and productive debates during these 2 weeks. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I have the delegation from the Czech Republic, followed by Albania.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Czech Republic aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union, so I just would like to add a few national remarks. First of all, I'd like to join others in thanking the Slovak OSCE Chairmanship and ODIHR for organizing this year's HDM and Poland for hosting it. We know that it was a truly challenging task. HDM is a unique platform for dialogue with representatives of civil society and human rights defenders, as well as among participating states, and it must be preserved. The respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms is a cornerstone of the OSCE comprehensive approach to security. The Czech Republic is honored that through our ongoing chairmanship and of the OSCE Human Dimension Committee, we can help strengthen the implementation of the OSCE Human Dimension commitments and support of the OSCE autonomous institutions. Since January 2019, the HDC platform in Vienna has discussed several key topics relevant for everyday life, including freedom of expression and addressing disinformation, promoting tolerance and non-discrimination, participation in public and political life, torture prevention, gender equality, and effective follow-up to elections. We have invited civil society representatives from different parts of the OSCE region to contribute to the committee's deliberations. Madam Chair, this year marks the 30th anniversary of the Velvet Revolution in the former Czechoslovakia. The peaceful students' demands for democracy, respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms triggered large-scale peaceful demonstrations and become part of bigger events in Europe, which caused the fall of the Iron Curtain between the East and West and marked the beginning of a new era. These principles cannot be taken for granted. Today, the need for protection and promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms in many parts of the OSCE region is as relevant as it was in November 1989. We therefore thank the representatives of civil society and human rights defenders who are present here for coming to Warsaw, and look forward to constructive discussions during the upcoming 2 weeks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before I give the floor to the delegation of Albania, I just want to mention that I have obviously not been firm enough on the time limits with those who have spoken until now. And due to that, and also because we have more speakers than initially on the list, I have to limit the time to 3 minutes for those who come after this. But Albania has the floor now, and after that, Liechtenstein.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to join other delegations in congratulating the Slovak chairmanship and ODIHR for organizing this year's HDM in difficult circumstances and within very limited time constraints. We also thank the Polish government for their splendid hospitality and for their kindness in hosting this annual meeting. Albania highly values the outstanding cooperation with the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights and other OSCE autonomous institutions, as they play a significant role in helping, assisting, and supporting OSCE participating states in committing to the democratic principles and fundamental freedoms that constitute the cornerstones of our societies. Albania remains committed to the promotion, protection, and enforcement of human rights. At home, the National Strategy for Development and Integration and the other sectoral strategies are fully in line with Agenda 2030, aiming to promote the principle of equality and non-discrimination. State and independent institutions are working intensively to promote gender equality and the rights of vulnerable groups, including children, minorities, people with disabilities, LGBTI, and the elderly, in order to ensure their active participation in society. Special attention has been attached to the empowerment of women and girls and gender equality. Participation of women in public life and policy making is exemplary and I believe a good example for the region. Albania considers civil society an essential part in fulfilling our joint human dimension commitments. In that respect, we will continue to work with the OSCE Secretariat, respecting governments and civil society groups across the region to promote respect for the human rights and fundamental freedoms. In our view, dialogue and trust among government and non-government actors are fundamental in addressing current and future challenges in the OSCE region. During the 2020 chairmanship of the organization, Albania aims to continue the good work of the previous chairmanships and also bring forward many crucial issues related to the agenda of the third dimension of the OSCE and supporting the budgets, mandates and autonomy of ODIHR and other OSCE institutions. The Albanian Chairmanship 2020 will continue to work for the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms in times when racism, xenophobia and other forms of intolerance and discrimination remain key challenges for our common security and welfare of people. We should remain firm in delivering concrete results to the implementation of human dimension commitments. We will continue to dedicate efforts and resources to the fight against any kind of discrimination based on ethnic, religious, cultural, racial or linguistic, and promote tolerance in order to foster the security in the OSCE region. Freedom of the media and safety of journalists will be high on our agenda for next year. The engagement of youth, women and civil society in decision-making and contributing to peace, dialogue, justice and peaceful coexistence, trust and reconciliation will continue to be among the priorities of the third dimension. In concluding, let me reiterate Albania's full support to the work of the three autonomous institutions of ODIHR, RFIM and HCNM. We're looking forward to fruitful discussions during these 2 weeks of HDIM, and thank you.
Thank you, and now I have the delegation of Liechtenstein, followed by Tajikistan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. At the outset, let me thank the Slovak chairmanship and ODIHR for organizing this year's HDIM and the Polish government for its long-standing commitment to this important event as its generous host. We welcome that this year's meeting can take place based on an agenda adopted by consensus. At the same time, we are concerned about how difficult it has become to agree on this agenda. The issue of civil society participation is very important, and we are a strong supporter of interaction and cooperation with civil society. We hope that we will be able to improve the situation and ensure an early adoption of the HDIM agenda next year. Madam Chair, this year Liechtenstein celebrates its 300th birthday. There are manifold reasons why a small state as ours was able to ensure its sovereignty over such a long time. In addition to the close relationship to our neighbors, one important reason has been our membership in international organizations. Human rights, the rule of law, and democracy are central pillars of our understanding of the state. Celebrating our country's 300th anniversary, therefore, also means reaffirming our dedication to these fundamental values and principles and to all organizations and multilateral processes that strengthen them worldwide. Against this backdrop, we commend and support ODIHR's work and are highly committed to the implementation of our human dimension commitments. We very much welcome the further development of our human dimension commitments on priority themes for Liechtenstein, such as preventing and combating violence against women and countering child trafficking. To reinforce the protection of women against violence, the Liechtenstein Criminal Code has just been revised to increase sentences for offenses against sexual self-determination and other sexual offenses, and to be generally compliant with the Council of Europe Istanbul Convention. Additionally, our national police is currently actively reviewing its approach to interventions in situations of domestic violence to further strengthen the protection of victims. With regard to countering child trafficking and human trafficking in general, we gladly announce that the Liechtenstein Initiative for a Financial Sector Commission on Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking will release its final report on 27 September 2019 in New York during the 71st session of the UN General Assembly. The report is a blueprint for accelerated action to put the financial sector at the heart of global efforts to tackle modern slavery and human trafficking, and offers concrete tools that the financial sector can use. I'm happy to share information on the initiative bilaterally in the margins of this conference. We are also committed to the progressive evolution of human dimension commitments with regard to other priority themes of our foreign policy, such as the prevention of torture. Torture still prevails in the OSCE region, and there have been important new developments in the fight against it, such as the Nelson Mandela rules. We would therefore welcome an enhanced engagement of the OSCE on the implementation of this important human rights guarantee and be supportive of a Ministerial Council deliverable to update and reinforce the OSCE's agenda on this matter. For now, we wish to reaffirm our full support to ODIHR and its programs from a normative perspective, as well as a donor state, and hope that this year's H-Team will be but one more step in furthering the implementation of the OSCE's third dimension. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I have the delegation of Tajikistan, followed by Switzerland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Allow me to greet all of the participants of the annual ODIHR meeting with OSCE on the human dimension. And I would also like to bear witness of my respect for the organization and to Poland for creating these wonderful conditions for our work. This is an annual tradition now that brings together all of the OSCE participating states, cooperation partners, representatives of civil society, international organizations, and others. And it creates a true platform to discuss the obligations of states in line with the principles of the Helsinki Final Act, to exchange experience and opinions, and to discuss issues with regard to broadening cooperation. In the plenaries and in the side events, we will discuss issues that are very pertinent to our countries today. Moreover, it is also very important not only to discuss the issues themselves, as discussing ways to tackle these issues. Tajikistan faces our obligations in the area of human rights, takes them seriously. As a member of the international community, we've strengthened our domestic laws in protecting human rights and in having passed all of the human rights documents of the United Nations. We have very many programs and plans on this front. We have a very important document on human rights, and we are conducting important reforms. There are various national strategies and plans and programs in the area of human rights and monitoring mechanisms and implementation of these obligations. Tajikistan will continue and strengthen our work in human rights defense and in fundamental freedoms in cooperation with all countries and international organizations working in this area. Tajikistan welcomes the assistance of ODIHR in strengthening law-making and improving our human rights laws, in strengthening the rule of law, in improving democratic institutes, on gender rights and involving women in political life. We are specifically concerned with issues of international regional security, mainly combating human trafficking, drug trafficking, and corruption. We are working together with other organizations in building security throughout the world and stepping up our fight with terrorism and extremism. We believe that one of the main issues that we should discuss here is working with other OSCE countries so that we can all help each other in the area of human rights defense. We need to focus on constructive discussions and tackling ways of tackling these problems. Recommendations need to develop recommendations and not just to criticize each other. And our practice and recommendations need to correspond to the interest of participating states. I'm convinced that our dialogue will help us implement all of the obligations in the OSCE on the human dimension. Once again, I would like to thank the ODIHR of the OSCE for organizing this event. I am convinced that we will achieve our goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to the delegation of Switzerland, followed by Canada.
Thank you very much. We would like to thank the Slovakian chairmanship of the OSCE for their tireless efforts in assuring that the human dimension issues are discussed here. We also would like to thank the Polish hosts in hosting this event today. My delegation extremely pleased that for the next 2 weeks we will be discussing the implementation of all of our shared obligations under the human dimension. We would like to find out more about the progress made in participating states and about decisions that need to be made. ODIHR ensures that progress is made in discussing the issues under the human dimension. This cannot be repeated too often. The human rights agenda is a preventive one. When human rights are attacked, these are often the first signs that an armed conflict is brewing, and often this leads to human rights violations. Human rights, we know, is something that promotes sustainable development and peace. And so multilateral policies and diplomacy continue to play a central role in this struggle. Madam Chair, in recent months, in many participating states, citizens have gone onto the streets to demand more economic, social, political, and civil rights. They strive for something which is very human, that is the right to determine their own future. This year, thousands of school children are going out into the streets in participating states of the OECD, demanding that governments make some hard decisions with regard to combating climate change. The most effective means of ensuring that people have the right to protest and express their opinions and to build trust among citizens is to have a free dialogue based on integration. We must do this, first of all, by listening to each other. And here Switzerland is very concerned when we observe the increasing limitations of civil society in participating states. We welcome the representatives of civil society here at the ODIHR meeting. Many have come from afar in order to enter into dialogue with participating states. Civil society representatives are the crucial link between the aspirations of citizens and their governments. Their voices are very important here at the ODIHR, and we need to make sure that we hear them. Madam Chair, Switzerland is deeply concerned with the torture and ill treatment in the OSCE region. We are wondering these days, is the ban against torture and ill treatment being called into question? Such a trend needs to be halted urgently. This is why Switzerland will continue to combat torture and any kind of ill treatment in the OSCE region. In December, we would like to make sure that a ministerial council decision is passed at the ministerial in December. We welcome the tireless efforts of ODIHR and the media freedom representative, as well as the representative for minorities and field operations. Switzerland will continue to lend our support to your efforts. Let us all make sure we use this opportunity to use this as a platform for discussion and to strengthen our shared obligations on the basis of respect and inclusivity. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I have Canada on my list, followed by Turkmenistan.
Madam Director, Madam Chairperson, let me begin by thanking you for having former President Lech Walesa here to offer a keynote speech in which he reminded us of the power of the human spirit and the desire for liberty, and how strong they are, even when we are being faced with negative trends of increasing populism and authoritarianism in the OSCE. Excellencies, colleagues, and representatives of civil society, the human dimension represents an integral pillar of our shared comprehensive security, and participating actively at HDIM is a demonstration of Canada's commitment to fundamental freedoms and human rights. HDIM provides us with a premier forum in which to ask ourselves whether we are living up to our promises, and provides us the opportunity to challenge those who we feel are not living up to theirs. To be brief, Canada shares the many concerns raised by other speakers, including in particular with regard to the attempted illegal annexation of Crimea and Sevastopol, which we do not and will not recognize, human rights abuses in Crimea, the ongoing Russian involvement in the war in Ukraine, as well as the human rights situation in Chechnya and the Russian Federation more generally. Indeed, the trend towards a deteriorating and ever more challenging human rights situation continued unabated this past year in the OSCE region. The overall picture shows democracies under threat, media freedom at greater risk, civil society restricted, and intolerance and discrimination rising. In many places, the right of peaceful assembly is not, in fact, a reality. Hate crimes driven by racism, xenophobia, misogyny, and bigotry are increasingly common. Indeed, gender equality, discrimination of half our populations, remains pervasive despite efforts undertaken in many participating states. Against this backdrop, the holding of HDIM itself is a ray of light. The meeting has retained its importance as a means to reinforce a responsibility to uphold our commitments and to hold states to account. It represents a unique opportunity to gather as diplomats, civil society representatives, activists, and journalists to address these threats head-on and discuss ways that we can uphold ideals and commitments first enshrined in the Helsinki Final Act and subsequently strengthened. Indeed, at the Milan Ministerial Council, 2 new decisions related to the human dimension on safety of journalists and on combating violence against women were agreed. We as OC participating states now need to work with civil society to more effectively implement and respect these new commitments as well as existing ones. Too many states ignore or dismiss these commitments and often distort the reasons behind these actions in order to engender indifference or even support for undermining them. Canada will play an active role in the working sessions of this meeting, Madam Chairman, and we will continue to espouse our firmly held beliefs in the value and necessity of diversity, peaceful pluralism, and our firmly held belief in the respect for all human rights. Most importantly, we are looking forward to hearing from civil society and to engaging with them and their representatives during the side events and in the corridors of this meeting. It is essential that we hear your voices, your perspectives, and your recommendations. Thank you, Madam Chairperson.
Thank you. And now I have the delegation from Turkmenistan, followed by the Holy See.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and distinguished participants, and distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Strengthening democratic principles and the foundations of our societies and states, the implementation of economic, social, and other rights and freedoms of each individual, the further development of civil society, improving the quality of life for populations are the main priorities of the state policies of Turkmenistan. In Turkmenistan today, we're implementing legislative, institutional, and administrative measures in order to upgrade the mechanisms that ensure human rights and freedoms. And working on this front is something that the head of our state constantly monitors. Our country participates in over 150 multilateral conventions and treaties that obligate all participating states to compare their national standards in these important areas with international ones. Our national laws in Turkmenistan have consistently include the standards of international law. Considering this task, we have established and are implementing new work in order to further upgrade our national laws. In recent years, we have accumulated some very good experiences working with the UN structural agencies in the framework of joint efforts in the area of democratization, rule of law, human development, all in order to reach the Sustainable Development Goals. In order to continue to improve the work of state bodies and civil society organizations in ensuring human rights and fundamental freedoms, the implementation of international humanitarian standards into our national laws, as well as the practical aspect of this implementation, the presidential decrees have helped us to promote gender equality in Turkmenistan. The National Plan in the area of human rights and the National Action Plan on the implementation of the rights of children in Turkmenistan. And we are elaborating a new phase of our National Action Plan on countering human trafficking because we have successfully completed the previous phase that has lended some very good results. That was in 2018, and as part of the previous plan, a new law was passed on countering human trafficking. We have improved our penal code, the law on employment and the work of lawyers as well as others. In February of 2019, we have passed a national action plan up to 2024 on statelessness. The national plans and actions are very important national mechanisms that are based on our Constitution and strengthen the fact that we are devoted to pursuing the aims of human rights and fundamental freedoms and in promoting democratics in line with the Presidential Program for Economic and Social Development years 2020-2025. In order to implement these, a system of measures has been established on the basis of our priorities. The norms of international law. And as part of this cooperation, we have projects with the UNDP and with the UN Population Fund with regard to financing, and also specific projects on the human dimension are also being conducted together with the OSCE Center in Ashgabat. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to the Holy See, followed by Andorra.
Madam Chairman, the Holy See is pleased to take part of this 2019 HDM and thanks Poland for its hospitality, as well as the Slovak chairmanship and the ODIHR for planning and organizing this meeting. The HDM is a central component of the OSCE structure, as it allows all 57 participating states not only to take stock of, but also to confirm our common course toward a region second to none in its respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Therefore, my delegation considers it crucial that the HDM remains among the consensus-based OSCE meetings and expresses its satisfaction with the approval by the Permanent Council of the entire agenda of this HDM in accordance with the relevant OSCE decisions. However, it is hoped that the very late adoption of the HDM decisions will not become a precedent for the coming years. The Holy See wishes to underline again that the universality of human rights represents a crucial question for our age, a real topic, stantis aut cadentis, the answer to which will determine whether human rights continue to mark the common horizon for the construction of our societies, the necessary point of reference for the exercise of political power, and a guide for the path to be followed by the international community. Two developments in particular are of concern in this regard. First, as Pope Francis noted in his address to the diplomatic corps, the interpretation of some rights has progressively changed with the inclusion of a number of new rights that not infrequently conflict with one another. A wide variety of interpretations of certain rights and the affirmation of new rights may create more obstacles to universal consensus rather than facilitate it. In this regard, it is crucial that participating states seek a more unified concept of what the human rights signifies, thereby avoiding that the human dimension continue to fall ever further behind the first and the second dimensions. Second, the universality of human rights is based on the idea that all universal human rights and fundamental freedoms must be protected and promoted. This universality is at risk when some human rights are ignored, when a hierarchy among human rights is established, or when an inadequate approach to rights conditions to vary respect for human rights. While our delegation and civil society organizations express a desire for the increased protection and advancement of human rights and fundamental freedoms, at times this is accompanied by biased approaches to universal human rights and fundamental freedoms that seek to advance issues on which there is no consensus among participating states, thus falling outside the scope of the meeting. One possible way forward is the following: that the 57 OSCE participating states unite around a common understanding of OSCE commitments in the third basket and on the universal principles of human rights and fundamental freedoms that underpin the human dimension. Madam Chairman, The full version of this statement will be submitted to the distribution days. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm told now by those who are taking care of the speakers list that I still have to limit the time that the speakers have and go down to 2 minutes. Unfortunately, because we have had more speakers on the list than we foresee in the beginning. But now I give the floor to Andorra, followed by Iceland.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. I would like to join previous speakers in thanking ODIHR and the Slovak chairmanship for organizing this year's HDIM and the Polish government for the continuous hospitality. The HDIM confirms the importance of multilateralism in the promotion of human rights, which is taking inclusive actions that have a direct and positive impact in the life of our citizens. The meeting offers a unique platform for a dialogue among NGOs and governments to review the implementation of the OSCE commitments in the human dimension. In this framework, I want to underline the relevance of the participation of civil society organizations in the OSCE events. The protection and the promotion of human rights is a priority for Andorra at national and international level, in particular at the United Nations, OSCE and Council of Europe. Andorra attaches great importance to education on human rights and democratic citizenship. A quality and inclusive education is a driver to promote tolerance, multiculturalism, and non-discrimination, and it's essential to promote gender equality at all levels. It ensures the equal access to opportunities, and it's a key factor in creating inclusive and safer societies that allow an active participation and integration of all citizens in the political and public sphere. Madam Chairperson, Andorra is fully committed to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. To this end, the government has recently approved the National Strategic Plan of Action to implement the 2030 Agenda that engage all stakeholders, government, private sector, civil society, and academic sector in order to share experience and to coordinate the actions and programs that will put in place in order to implement the 2030 Agenda. In this context, I want to highlight that the government of Andorra strongly advocates for policies based on democratic participation as the most effective way to create the improvements that they are in the interest and to the benefit of our citizens. In that sense, the new elected head of government has created a new Secretariat of State for citizens' participation and equality to promote public participation and to implement the recent law on equality and non-discrimination adopted last February. To conclude, allow me to praise ODIHR activities in the field of election observation and thank the institution for the deployment last February of the needs assessment mission to Andorra in view of the parliamentary elections that took place in last April 7th. We follow the recommendations made. Thank you, Madam Chairperson.
Thank you. And before I give the floor to the next speaker, allow me to remind you that delegations have the right to reply. If they want to make use of that right, they have to notify the person taking care of the speakers list here behind me. But now I give the floor to Iceland, followed by Georgia.
Madam Chair, we align with the EU statement, but I would like to say a few words in national capacity, and allow me to thank our Polish hosts for their hospitality and ODIHR for organizing this most important gathering within the human dimension, bringing to the table representatives of member states, civil society, and the distinguished keynote speaker Lech Wałęsa. The commitment to human rights, gender equality, and fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction as to race, language, or religion, was established in the UN Charter almost 75 years ago. Still, however, these fundamental freedoms are being challenged in many countries by individuals, but also by state-sponsored violence. We welcome the HDIM emphasis on the freedom of expression and the precarious situation of journalists and the media in the OSCE area. Our message should be clear. The media is an integral part of the democratic and pluralistic society and fundamental for our common security. The conference in London this summer sharpened our focus in these matters, and as a follow-up, Iceland will increasingly prioritize media freedom in its work within the international fora. Needless to say, the fight for people's minds and opinions has become very complicated due to new media and communications technology. And last week in Prague, we discussed digital developments, which bring many opportunities, but also have potential to create challenges, risks, and threats. Emerging trends in state actions to control and impede access to and use of digital technologies with the aim of limiting fundamental freedoms are of grave concern. We are concerned that the targeted surveillance of journalists, civil society, politicians, and others has assumed Orwellian proportions. Sustainable peace can only be accomplished with active inclusion and meaningful participation of those affected by conflict, irrespective of their gender. And women must have a seat at the table, and the voices must be heard. And effective implementation of the Security Council Resolution 3025 would strengthen the comprehensive security role of the OSCE. Now, women, children, ethnic minorities, and people with disabilities and LGBTI persons are particularly vulnerable to discrimination. LGBTI persons continue to face discrimination, social exclusion, harassment, torture, and even arbitrary
Need
killings.
to remind of the time limit.
Thank you. In some states, and Iceland has made the rights of LGBTI individuals a priority during its membership in the Human Rights Council. Thank you.
Thank you, and now I give the floor to Georgia, followed by the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. Let me start by thanking the Slovak chairmanship of DEAR and Poland for once again organizing the largest human rights event in Europe, a unique format that enables us to discuss and review the state of human rights in our respective countries and the implementation of the shared commitments. Upholding human rights is an absolute prerequisite for stability, security, and prosperous development of our nations. While we recognize the progress achieved in many areas across the OSCE, we should reflect on worrying developments of the blatant violation of fundamental rights and freedoms that still prevails. We believe that since the OSCE's comprehensive and cooperative approach to security is based on the inherent dignity of all individuals and protection of their human rights and freedoms, our organization should enhance efforts aimed at duly addressing the violations of Helsinki principles and our shared commitments. The establishment of security arrangements, international security arrangements in the Russia-occupied territories, and unimpeded access of human rights monitoring mechanisms are urgently needed for the safety and security on the ground. As we speak, ethnic Georgians in Russia-occupied Abkhazia and South Ossetia regions of Georgia are subjected to discrimination based on their ethnicity. Violations of freedom of movement, right to education, health are a daily occurrence on these regions. All this against a backdrop of hundreds of thousands of IDPs and refugees being expelled from the occupied regions as a result of several waves of ethnic cleansing and still unable to return to their homes in safety and dignity. We are concerned over alarming humanitarian consequences stemming from Russia's aggression against Ukraine. We welcome the exchange of detainees that took place earlier this month and hope that this exchange will be a first step in increased efforts to bring lasting peace in Ukraine. Ensuring respect of human rights is an unwavering will of all Georgian citizens and represents a constitutionally guaranteed principle binding all current and future governments in the fulfillment of following duties: inviolability of human rights by the state, defense against human rights violations by others, creation of a system that will allow persons to realize their rights in practice.
Apologize, but I have to remind of the time limit.
The population of their human rights. We fully acknowledge that this is a never-ending process, and we are determined to overcome the challenges by consistent and effective implementation of our international and national commitment. I thank you, Madam Chairperson.
Thank you, and now I give the floor to the Russian Federation, followed by Kyrgyzstan.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson.
Throughout the meeting, I've been busy scribbling away to shorten my statement. I do apologize if I have failed to shorten it sufficiently. We will be handing the text over to the Secretariat. Madam Chairperson, distinguished colleagues, at this current stage of our cooperation on human rights can be characterized by a significant uptick in the level of confrontation and politicization. Human rights are frequently being used as a tool to meddle in the domestic affairs of states and also a tool to achieve political objectives. The OSCE is also characterized by a number of systemic problems, including geographical and thematic imbalance, an absence of comprehensive assessments of the human rights situation throughout the OSCE area. Attempts to promote the humanitarian dimension at the humanitarian dimension meeting, topics which have nothing to do with human rights as well as non-consensus wording only serve to exacerbate the situation. This approach has resulted in an unjustified broadening of the interpretation of decisions taken by the organization's governing bodies. They are at odds with the principle of consensus, the bedrock of the OSCE's activities. We'd like to underline that this principle is also at the heart of the work of the OSCE's executive bodies, which should be transparent and accountable to participating states. These activities should be conducted in line with the decision taken by OSCE bodies, collective bodies, and the agreed mandates. The same goes for elections. We insist on coming up with a sole methodology for election observation agreed to by all participating states, including when it comes to addressing new challenges cropping up in this sphere. The situation in the southeast of Ukraine continues to get worse. There's no alternative to a political and diplomatic settlement to the internal crisis in Ukraine. There is no alternative to the implementation of the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk agreements in full and consistently. Kiev has been sabotaging the upholding of its commitments under these agreements. It has been dodging efforts to involve it in a direct dialogue with representatives of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. This situation in the Ukraine should be a priority for the OSCE. The Ukrainian authorities have clamped down on freedom of expression. They're clamping down on media, which are reporting stories not to their liking. It's intimidating independent journalists and public figures. Religious rights are also being trampled. We have seen scant improvement of late, including when it comes to pressure put on religious leaders. The adoption of discrimination laws in the sphere of the state language and education aimed at the forced and wholesale Ukrainization of all spheres of society are at odds with Kiev's international obligations. Furthermore, they go against the spirit of the Minsk package of measures, which enshrined the right of Ukrainian citizens living in parts of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions to linguistic self-determination. Furthermore, in these laws, there are some preferences, for instance, preferences for EU languages, which serve to doubly discriminate against the Russian language. We've also seen the falsification of the history of the Second World War. Neo-Nazism has been nurtured. We've seen xenophobia, religious intolerance, and vandalism. These are now common currency in Ukraine. These have resulted from the acquiescence of the governments in the Baltic states. We've seen SS members, former SS members, and the acolytes meeting on an annual basis in Latvia and Estonia. And the non-titular population is portrayed as a threat to national security. And I am wrapping up, I do assure you. It's also inadmissible that they have the disgraceful phenomenon of statelessness on a mass scale. The OSCE should not stand idly by as the bedrock of the current system of international human rights protection is undermined. Its roots can be traced back to the Nuremberg decisions. Next year, we'll be celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Second World War. There should be an incentive for us to combat the glorification of Nazism, neo-Nazism, and the falsification of history. We've seen increasing concerns about double standards in the approaches taken by some participating states to protecting the freedom of opinion. We've seen journalists and the mass media persecuted, subjected to sanctions for their independent opinions, deported, banned from entering certain territories, from attending various events. Some media have been blacklisted and censored. We're also worried about the position of Christians and Muslims in the OSCE and contiguous regions. Participating states should combat all forms of religious intolerance and fanaticism. We must implement the OSCE Ministerial Council's instructions issued in Basel to elaborate ministerial declarations on combating intolerance and discrimination, including against Muslims, Christians, and members of other faiths. Last but not least, by way of conclusion, I should like to remind you that the reference point for us at the Humanitarian Dimension meeting should be a consensus-based agenda, an agenda that can unite us all. And this has already been mentioned today. We're in favor of a frank dialogue on an equal footing, without double standards, without focus on short-term political objectives. We're in favor of dialogue and constructive cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to the delegation of Kyrgyzstan, followed by Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. The Kyrgyz Republic believes that the Warsaw meeting of the OSCE is a singular platform for dialogue at which representatives of civil society and governments can discuss the OSCE's human dimension commitments. My delegation hopes that we'll be able to engage in constructive dialogue with the view to strengthening democracy, freedom, and human rights. Distinguished participants, the Kyrgyz Republic is moving towards democracy and humanism. This is a choice that we've made. Over the last few years, the Kyrgyz Republic has made substantial headway towards a democratic society. Our democratic model has been sorely tested. The events of 2005 and 2010 illustrate this amply. As things stand in the Kyrgyz Republic, parliamentary democracy is going from strength to strength. We have adopted legislation which is in line with the norms enshrined in international law. We've reformed the law enforcement system and the judiciary. In 2016, we ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We believe that this ratification is an important step on the way to improving the human rights situation in the Kyrgyz Republic. We're going to continue in the same vein so that political, social, economic, and cultural rights in the Kyrgyz Republic can be upheld, including by implementing international human rights standards, transposing them into national legislation, and enforcing them, all the while adapting these to the national idiosyncrasies. Having said that, we are upholding our commitments within the framework of the OSCE, collaborating closely with ODIHR. We cannot but mention the election observation missions and the work that's been done there, and we'll continue working hand in hand with ODIHR on that front. I wanted to inform you that in order to ensure gender equality and uphold the rights of persons with disabilities, the President of the Kyrgyz Republic recently signed a legislation introducing amendments to our legislation. And in fact, 30% of seats will now be set aside for women, and some seats will be assigned for persons with disabilities. I am wrapping up, Madam. Also, we are working closely with the RFOM and the High Commissioner for National Minorities, taking part in a number of events. Distinguished participants, we need to take into account the national and regional idiosyncrasies. We need to take into account the religious and other idiosyncrasies of each state as we seek to uphold our commitments. We have been implementing our commitments to the letter, and we will continue to implement our commitments. We are open to further cooperation with international organizations, NGOs, and civil society at large. We wish you every success here at this meeting and a constructive dialogue. Thank you for your kind attention. I will be sending you a copy of my statement.
Thank you, and I have to apologize to those who are still on my speakers list. I have 4 participating states on the speaking list and then some rights to reply, but we have to finish strictly at 1 o'clock because we don't have interpretation after that. So I please ask you to stick to the time limits. Now I have Bosnia-Herzegovina on my list, after that Spain.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm honored today to speak on behalf of Bosnia-Herzegovina during the opening of the 2019 OSCE Human Dimension Implementation Meeting. Hats off to the Slovak chairmanship for dedicated work on building consensus for HDM agenda this year, as well as the Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights for preparation on this meeting. We see it as the best platform for OSCE participating states, partners for cooperation, OSCE executive structures, international organizations and civil society to discuss and follow up on the OSCE human dimension commitments. We highly value the work of the 3 OSCE autonomous institutions in assisting all participating states to implement their OSCE commitments. Their engagement and visible change is a measurable indicator on the ground in number of participating states, including Bosnia and Herzegovina. In upcoming days, we will be able to openly discuss how to push the changes from the slow motion to fast forward mode, how to address the challenges and transform them to opportunities. A number of challenges is increasing. Freedom of media, free and fair elections, women's rights and gender equality, as well as a number of other commitments needs to be occasionally contested against common indicators in order to keep us all accountable regarding already accepted OSCE human dimension commitments. We welcome this year's concept of HDIM to be focused on issues like safety of journalists, hate crime, and Roma and Sinti. Madam Chair, contrary to continued shrinking space for civil society to freely operate and fulfill its corrective role in each society, forums like this has to enable everyone to speak loud. As we could hear already today, human rights cannot be taken as granted. Results made in past decades and reached benchmarks needs to be followed, where any kind of backlashes is not acceptable. Key values of each democratic society, like basic human rights, rule of law, political stability, and economic development, has to be a reference point for any action to be taken in the future. In this context, Bosnia-Herzegovina remains dedicated to implementation of all commitments, although faced with serious issues and blockages of implementation of election results, even 11 months after elections, with unreasonable conditioning from some political actors. In the end, I wish us all substantial and fruitful discussions next few days. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I have Spain, followed by Armenia.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Spain fully endorses a statement of the European Union. At the same time, we would like to make some comments in our national capacity. Participating states in the conference in 1990, in the second HIM meeting, once again reiterated the fundamental appeals of Europe at that time, recalling that democracy cannot exist unless it is based on free elections and a state of law. 30 years on, with a democratization process that has practically been finalized in the east of our area, this statement remains true. As the Venice Commission said, democracy is promoted through rules and law. Spain has now gone through a populist phase, which claims that the Constitution weakens democracy, but this is a contradiction. Democracy and Constitution are not mutually exclusive. Promoting a Constitution and a democracy focuses on fundamental laws and freedoms. We must make sure that democracy is based on specific concrete laws. The European Charter of Human Rights in its preamble states that the human being is at the center of this document. Fundamental rights and freedoms, the fighting discrimination must be the fundamental tasks of promoting democracy in the democratization process. All of this is linked to civil and economic and social rights, such as education, culture, or protecting health. with regard to promoting human rights, Spain has made sure that this is one of our priorities for our foreign policy. We have done this as a member of the UN Human Rights Council from 2018 to 2020. Spain will continue to contribute to a free OSCE space, which is democratic, which is ruled by law, and in the defense of democratic institutions. Thank you very much. I will provide my statement to the Secretary. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I have Armenia on the list, and after that Belarus, who is the last speaker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Distinguished Secretary General, distinguished heads of OSCE institutions. We fully agree with those who voiced their support for the HDIM and the importance of this gathering, and also we accept the invitation for an open and sincere dialogue during these 2 weeks. We share those assessments of and concerns of the setbacks and limitations of democratic practices in the OSCE area, and not only. But let me share with you some positive outlook and reflect on the most recent development in my own country, which kind of broke with these trends and developments. The democratic, peaceful, velvet, non-violent revolution last year in Armenia broke with the wild practices of imitation policies of the former authorities. Why did this happen, this revolution, these developments? First, that the people, they embraced the power of the democratic idea and the principle of their full participation, that every voice and every citizen counts in democratic societies. Second, it was the vibrant and target-oriented civil society which came in support of the democratic changes in Armenia. And the third reason probably was that the imitational practices of playing democracy of former authorities of Armenia fully exhausted themselves. And now we are in the process of profound change and transformation, which culminated also in legislative area by the early parliamentary elections in December last year. And now highly on our agenda is the full reform of the judiciary to make it completely independent and functional in terms of the democratic practices and democratic society. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I have Belarus as the last speaker on the list.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. The Republic of Belarus attaches great importance to the OSCE as a key platform for dialogue in the Euro-Atlantic and Eurasia when it comes to matters of security. We are developing constructive dialogue with the OSCE across the three baskets. Specifically, we've been cooperating very closely with ODIHR, implementing a number of projects hand in hand with ODIHR, for instance, human rights education, the rule of law, and gender equality, to name but a few. One of Belarus's priorities in the humanitarian sphere, and also at the OSCE, is the fight against human trafficking. We are working hand in hand with the special representative of the OSCE on human trafficking issues. We're working very actively within the alliance, working to combat human trafficking. In response to the statement made, we'd like to state the following. We are open to cooperation and constructive dialogue with our international partners. A whole host of issues related to human rights, both in Belarus and in other EU countries, are regularly discussed within the framework of the Belarus-EU Coordination Group and the Belarus Human Rights Dialogue. These are, by the way, open to representatives of civil society. As regards the issue of capital punishment, we've stated our position on this topic on numerous occasions, so I won't delve into the details here because time's of the essence. The mass media. We have amended the law on the mass media that were discussed by Belarusian society at length in March. Mr. Harlem Desir, the OSCE representative on the freedom of the media, visited Belarus, and I'd like to use this opportunity to reiterate our willingness to cooperate constructively with Mr. Desir's office. We continue to hone our legislation in other spheres. For instance, the rules governing demonstrations and the criminal liability of non-registered organizations. We are seeking to make it easier for political parties and civil society organizations to register. On the 17th of November 2019, parliamentary elections are scheduled to take place in Belarus. We have done everything within our power to organize these elections in line with our international commitments and our national legislation. In the spirit of transparency, we've invited various international bodies to come and observe the elections, including the CIS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the OSCE, ODIHR. We also have an ODIHR mission that is scheduled to visit Belarus, an OSCE mission. We are working on improving our election legislation. Now, once again, I won't go into the details right now. Madam Chairperson, just the last thing I wanted to say. This year is a very special year for Belarus, as we will be marking the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Belarus from the Nazi occupation. We've done a great deal to maintain our memories of those who helped us to throw off this scourge. Therefore, we call on everyone to take systemic efforts to combat hate speech, anti-Semitism, neo-fascism, and other intolerance. We will be contributing to these efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This was the last statement from participating states, but 5 participating states or delegations have expressed interest in making use of the right of reply, and I can only give them 1 minute each, as our time is over already, but I will give them 1 minute each. And I have first here Azerbaijan, then followed by Turkmenistan.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. We value HDIM as it was originally designed to provide a platform for participating states and civil society to engage in dialogue with a view to improving implementation of relevant OSCE commitments. We are in favor of having effective dialogue on implementation of our shared commitments in an unpoliticized, result-oriented manner. We regret that in the EU statement there were unfounded accusations and allegations demonstrating lack of knowledge of the real situation in Azerbaijan. Double standards and selective approach of the EU in its assessment of political developments in the region question the objectivity of the expressed views. We are ready to continue to discuss any issues that are of interest to the EU in a constructive manner. During upcoming sessions, my delegation will give more information in its statements on specific issues mentioned in the EU statement. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, and thank you for respecting the time limit. Now I give the floor to Turkmenistan, followed by Ukraine.
Madam Chair, as my country was mentioned by the distinguished representative of the European Union, I would like to say that the Turkmen side continues its dialogue with the UN agencies, including the High Commissioner on Human Rights and the EU. As a result, many of the people mentioned in the list have been liberated, or we have provided full information on their status as the state of affairs at this current time, which is going forward very swiftly. We're continuing our constructive dialogue with the EU. The last negotiations round took place in March in Ashgabat. At that time, a broad range of issues on human rights were discussed and information was provided, including on the so-called violent disappearances. Our ministers are working on this issue with the appropriate UN institutes, including with the UN Working Group on Violent Disappearances. We We call on our partners to continue this constructive dialogue, and we are ready with equal cooperation with interested parties on this issue, as well as on other humanitarian issues. Thank you.
It's over, and now I give the floor to Ukraine, followed by the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. In reply to the statement delivered by the Russian Federation, let me state the following. There is no internal Ukrainian crisis. Internally, Ukraine is consistently developing on the way of democracy and respect to human rights, which was, by the way, confirmed in election observation reports after presidential and parliamentary elections in ODIHR's report, for instance. We have democratically elected president, democratically elected parliament, new government is formed, is working, well functioning. So there is no internal Ukrainian crisis. What we have here, or we have, that is Ukrainian-Russian military conflict. There is Russian occupation, temporary occupation of Ukrainian territory. And there are unlawful actions by the occupation administration, including on religious issues, human rights, etc. 1 minute is over. Thank you.
Thank you for respecting this 1 minute limit. And now I give the floor to the Russian Federation, followed by the USA.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. Just briefly, I wanted to respond by the statements which made mention of the Russian aggression, the occupation of Crimea, the Donbass, South Ossetia, and Abkhazia. First of all, Crimea was reunified with the Russian Federation on the basis of international law, including the principle of self-determination as guaranteed by the UN Charter, various international human rights compacts, and the 1970 Declaration on the Principles of International Law. That's the first thing. Second of all, in the southeast of Ukraine, there is a military conflict which is not international in nature. The parties to that conflict are Ukraine and the self-proclaimed People's Republics, LNR and DNR. The International Committee of the Red Cross has adopted this classification. As for South Ossetia and Abkhazia, we call on colleagues to at last recognize the political reality. And the reality is that there are two independent states there. Thank you.
Thank you. And then it is United States of America that have the word, the right to reply, are using the right to reply.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. We wish to exercise our right of reply in response to the statement of the Russian Federation. The conflict in eastern Ukraine is not internal. It is a conflict that Russia started and continues to drive. This represents a grave violation of the Helsinki Final Act. The United States fully supports Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, including its territorial waters. We do not, nor will we ever, recognize Russia's purported annexation of Crimea. We join our European and other partners in reaffirming our Minsk-related sanctions against Russia. They will remain in place until Russia fully implements its Minsk commitments. The separate Crimea-related sanctions will remain in place until Russia returns full control of the peninsula to Ukraine.
Thank you. And now I have Georgia that have expressed interest in using the right to reply.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me use the right of reply to the statement made by representative of Russian Federation about having two independent so-called countries of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Let me remind you that there is Georgia and there are no independent Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and in the territorial integrity of Georgia is recognized by all OSCE participating states, but Russia, which is still continues its occupation of Georgian territories in violation of 2008 ceasefire agreement. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Finland, on behalf of the European Union, has asked for the right to reply.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. I pass the floor to the EU delegation.
Thank you very much. I would like to join my US colleague, reiterate our strong condemnation of the illegal annexation of Crimea and Sevastopol to the Russian Federation. We will not recognize it, and also reiterate our firm support for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Georgia within its internationally recognized borders. as well as the policy of non-recognition and engagement concerning the breakaway Georgian regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Thank you.
Thank you. This was the last statement in this opening session and concludes the session. Allow me to thank all the speakers and the audience and especially the interpreters for staying a bit longer and giving us these extra minutes. Now I declare the Human Dimension Implementation meeting open, and I look forward to session 1 that starts at 3 o'clock. Thank you.